The morning Silas Mercer threw Naomi's suitcase off the porch steps. He was smiling, not a nervous smile, not an embarrassed one, a slow, satisfied smile, the kind a man wears when he's done this before and gotten away with it every single time. "Women don't belong in ledger rooms," he said, loud enough for every ranch hand in the yard to hear, especially not ones with criminal family histories. Naomi stood in the dirt, her papers scattered, her hands shaking, but not from fear, from something far more dangerous. She had seen this smile before, on the man who stole her family's ranch, on the judge who let him walk free. And now, here it was again, on a man who had no idea that the woman he was humiliating had already memorized every number he'd tried to hide. What would you do if someone took everything from you, and then smiled while doing it? If this story already has your heart racing, you won't want to miss a single moment. Subscribe to the channel right now and hit that like button. Then drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's begin. Naomi Carter had a rule. She'd made the morning her family lost everything. Never walk into a place looking like you need it. It was harder than it sounded. She was 34 years old, carrying a suitcase that weighed less than her pride, and stepping off a supply wagon into Red Hollow with $17 and a folded job advertisement she'd read so many times the creases had turned white. But she kept her chin level, she kept her pace steady. She walked the main street of that small, wind-scraped town like she'd chosen it on purpose. She hadn't, of course. Red Hollow had chosen her. Or rather, the only open bookkeeping position within 200 miles had chosen her, and she was in no position to be selective. The town itself was the kind of place that didn't bother pretending to be more than it was. One general store, a feed supplier, a post office that also served as a barbershop on Wednesdays. The saloon had a broken shutter on its left window that nobody had fixed in what looked like several seasons, and the church at the end of the road leaned slightly to the right, like a man who'd had one too many drinks and was trying not to show it. What Red Hollow had, though, what made it different from a dozen other dying frontier towns, was Blackstone Ranch. 3 miles outside town, 17,000 acres of working cattle land, the largest single operation in the territory. It employed nearly 40 men, bought from every local merchant, and carried enough economic weight that when Blackstone sneezed, Red Hollow caught cold. Naomi had done her research. She always did her research. What the job advertisement had said, experienced bookkeeper needed, honest references required, accommodation provided. What Naomi had read between those lines, someone left or was pushed out. And whoever is running this operation needs the numbers managed fast enough that they're not being particular about who does it. She'd taken the position sight unseen, because $17, no matter how carefully you rationed it, had a bottom. The ranch foreman who met her at the gate was a barrel-chested man named Dolan, who looked at her like she was a package he hadn't ordered and wasn't sure he wanted to sign for. "You're the bookkeeper," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "Naomi Carter," she said, and extended her hand. He shook it the way men shake hands with women when they think the whole gesture is unnecessary, briefly, without pressure, already looking past her toward the wagon. "You got more bags?" "This is everything." Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy, more like recalculation. "Operations manager runs the books with you," he said, turning and walking, clearly expecting her to follow. "Silas Mercer. He'll explain what we need." "What happened to the last bookkeeper?" she asked, keeping pace. Dolan didn't answer immediately. His boots found a rhythm on the hard-packed ground. "Moved on," he said finally. "When?" 3 weeks ago." "And before that one?" A pause, slightly longer. "About 4 months before that." Naomi stored that information the way she stored everything, quietly. In a part of her mind she kept very still. 2 bookkeepers in under a year. She filed it and said nothing. What? Her room was small, clean enough, and smelled like cedar and old soap. The window faced the eastern pasture, and she could hear cattle somewhere beyond it, moving through the early afternoon heat with that slow, indifferent confidence that cattle carry as their birthright. She unpacked in 20 minutes. She'd gotten efficient at that. The financial records were waiting for her in the office. A low-ceilinged room off the main ranch house with 2 desks, a locked cabinet, and a window that looked out onto the yard. The records were stacked in 4 leather binders, organized by quarter, And at first glance, they looked perfectly acceptable. At first glance. She didn't start reading them immediately. That was another rule she'd made for herself after losing the family ranch. Never begin a new set of numbers when your emotions are still unsettled. Her father had taught her that patience was the most underrated quality in a bookkeeper. The number that would ruin you was never the one screaming. It was always the quiet one, tucked 2 pages back, formatted to look like everything else. So she sat by the window instead. She watched the yard. She watched how people moved. The ranch hands came back from the afternoon's work in clusters of 2 and 3, unhitching horses and hanging tack with the automatic economy of men who'd done these same motions 10,000 times. They talked low. They laughed occasionally, normal enough on the surface. But she noticed one thing. When a certain figure crossed the yard, a lean, quiet man in a gray work shirt moving along the fence line with a bucket of feed, the conversation shifted, not dramatically. Nobody stopped talking, but they angled toward him slightly, the way a compass needle adjusts. Men who'd been walking with their eyes down lifted them. A man who'd been arguing with his partner about something let the argument go. The lean man in gray didn't appear to notice any of it. He set his bucket down, checked a fence post with his hand, said something to a younger hand nearby, and moved on. Naomi watched him for a long moment. Interesting, she thought. She met Silas Mercer the next morning. He came into the office while she was reviewing the supply manifests, and she knew before he said a word that this was going to be the kind of working relationship that required constant vigilance. It wasn't that he was obviously threatening, it was that he was too smooth, too deliberate. The kind of man who'd practiced his first impression so many times that it had stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like a performance. He was in his 50s, well-dressed for a working ranch in a way that suggested the work didn't really include him, and his handshake was the opposite of Dolan's, firm, extended, warm enough to seem genuine. "Miss Carter," he said, "we're glad to have someone with your background. A ranch this size needs precise management." "I'm looking forward to understanding the operation," she said, which was technically true. "Anything you need, you come to me directly," he said, and smiled. "We keep a tight ship here at Blackstone. Mr. Grayson's standards are very high." She looked up. "Mr. Grayson?" "The owner. He's not on the property often, a traveling man, busy with business interests elsewhere." Mercer's smile held steady. "I handle day-to-day operations in his absence, have for several years." She nodded and looked back at the manifests. "How often does he visit the ranch?" A fractional pause. "When his schedule allows." She let that settle and said nothing. But in the quiet of her own mind, something clicked into place. A large ranch, absentee owner, operations manager with complete practical authority, 2 bookkeepers gone in less than a year. She began reading the supply manifests more slowly. By noon, she had found the first irregularity. By 2 o'clock, she had found 3 more. They were small, deliberately small. That was what told her they weren't mistakes. Mistakes have a randomness to them. They go over. They go under. They cluster in busy periods when a person is moving too fast to double-check. These discrepancies were too consistent to be mistakes. A consistent small overage in feed supply invoices. A consistent rounding pattern in the labor logs that added up to hours never actually paid. Nothing that would leap out at you on a single page. Everything designed to be visible only if you were looking at all the pages together and looking for it. She closed the binder carefully and placed it back exactly where she'd found it. That evening, she took a walk. Not aimlessly. She wasn't the kind of woman who did anything aimlessly. But she needed air and she needed to think without walls around her thoughts. She followed the fence line that ran along the south pasture, working through what she knew against what she didn't know yet. She was so deep in her own calculations that she almost walked into him. The man in the gray shirt. He was sitting on the top rail of the fence, hat tipped back, watching the sky go orange over the hills with the total stillness of someone who'd made peace with silence a long time ago. He heard her footsteps on the dry grass and looked down without startling. "Evening," he said. "I'm sorry," she said, stopping. "I didn't see you." "I know," he said, and there was no criticism in it. He looked back at the sky. "You were thinking pretty hard." She regarded him for a moment. Up close, he was younger than she'd estimated from the window. Mid-30s, maybe a few years older than her. with the kind of sun-worn face that was honest about having been outside every day of its life. He had careful eyes, light brown, almost amber, the kind of eyes that watched rather than looked. "You're one of the hands here," she said. "That's right." He reached down and extended his hand without climbing off the fence. "Luke Grayson." She shook it. "Naomi Carter, new bookkeeper." He nodded once. "I know." "Of course," she said. "News travels fast on a ranch." "It does." His eyes returned to the horizon. "You settling in all right?" "Well enough," she paused. "Same last name as the owner." He glanced at her then, just briefly. "Common enough name." "Sure," she said, and left it at that, because she'd learned a long time ago that pressing too soon was how you closed a door that would have opened on its own. They stood in quiet for a moment. Or rather, she stood and he sat, both of them watching the last of the day bleed out of the sky. "You gonna stay?" he asked. Not pointed, just a question. She thought about the two bookkeepers before her, thought about the carefully hidden decimal adjustments in the feed invoices, thought about the $17 that had become $12 after the supply wagon driver expected a small fare. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to stay." He nodded, like that answer satisfied something he'd been wondering about. He didn't ask why or push for more. They stood there another moment in the cooling air, and then she said goodnight and walked back toward the ranch house, and she could feel those amber eyes watching her go with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not suspicion, not interest exactly, more like recognition, like he already knew something about her that she hadn't told him yet. She didn't sleep much that first night. This wasn't unusual for her. Her mind had a habit of working when her body stopped, rolling numbers and patterns and half-formed suspicions through its gears long after any reasonable person would have let it rest. She'd fought it for years, tried warm milk and chamomile and the various other remedies her mother had suggested. Eventually, she'd simply made peace with it. Some minds weren't built for easy sleeping. Some minds were built for finding things. By 3 in the morning, she'd identified the structural pattern in the wage logs. It wasn't just the rounding. There was something more deliberate underneath the rounding. A consistent deflation in the hours reported for specific categories of work. Fence repair. Waterline maintenance. The kind of outdoor, unglamorous, witness-poor work where a man was often alone or in pairs, far from anyone keeping official time. Hours shaved by 20, 30 minutes per entry, multiplied across 40 workers across multiple quarters. She added it in her head 3 different ways to make sure she hadn't made an error. Thousands of dollars. Gone. Not in one dramatic theft, but in tiny, patient increments, spread so thin across so many pages that you'd need to be looking specifically for it to see it at all. Her hands weren't shaking this time. Her hands were very still. She had passed the shaking stage. She was in the stage that came after, the cold and clear and purposeful stage that her father used to call the accountant's fury, when you'd found something wrong and you weren't going to stop until it was right. She needed more records. The locked cabinet in the office held at least 2 years of older ledgers. She needed to see how far back this went. She also needed to be very, very careful, because whoever had built this system had built it to survive scrutiny, and that meant they had thought about what happened if someone started looking. And the second she was seen looking, she became a problem to be managed. The next morning, she smiled pleasantly at Silas Mercer when he came to check her progress. She showed him the first quarter's invoices, walked him through her preliminary organization system, asked careful questions about the supplier relationships, and gave every indication of being a competent, untroubling woman who was simply doing the job she'd been hired to do. He left looking satisfied. The moment the door closed, her smile dropped. At midday, she brought a cup of coffee to the small group of hands eating lunch near the water trough and asked, in the chatty, offhand tone she'd practiced until it felt natural, whether anyone could tell her who she should talk to if she had a question about the fence work records. 3 men immediately looked at Luke Grayson. Not pointed, not obvious. Just a small, instinctive, simultaneous glance toward the man eating quietly at the end of the bench. He looked up, met her eyes, and his expression gave away nothing at all, which, in her experience, was itself a kind of answer. "Dolan handles work records," he said evenly. "Right," she said. "Thank you." But later that afternoon, when she was crossing the yard with a bundle of quarterly invoices, he fell into step beside her without announcement, like it was something he'd just decided to do on his way somewhere else. "You're going to find some things you don't expect," he said quietly, not looking at her. She kept walking. "Like what?" "I can't say specifically." His voice was steady and low. "But if you find something that looks strange in the older supply records, the ones from 2 years back, don't bring it to Mercer." She stopped. He stopped too, a half-beat later. "Why not?" she asked. He met her eyes then, direct, without flinching. "Because Mercer is the reason the last two bookkeepers left." The air between them was very still. "Left," she said. "Or were pushed." He didn't answer that. Which was, she understood, his way of answering it. "Who do I bring it to?" she asked. For just a moment, something complicated moved through his expression, something that looked almost like a decision being made. "I'll tell you," he said, "when the time is right." "That's not very specific." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He touched the brim of his hat in that small, courteous gesture men out here used as punctuation, and walked on, and she stood watching him go with the same feeling she'd had the night before, that she was looking at someone who was carrying considerably more than he was letting on. A ranch hand who warned new bookkeepers away from the operations manager. A ranch hand the other men gravitated toward without being asked to. A ranch hand named Grayson, same as the absent owner of the land he worked. "Common enough name," he'd said. She turned back toward the office. She had records to read. She had a locked cabinet to find a way into. And she had a careful, quiet man to figure out before he figured her out first. Outside the window, the cattle moved through the pasture with their slow, indifferent confidence, and the late afternoon light turned the whole of Blackstone Ranch a deep and untrustworthy gold. Beautiful, the way things are beautiful just before they get complicated. And Naomi Carter, who had been here less than 48 hours and already knew more than anyone wanted her to know, sat back down at her desk and opened the ledger to the next page. She had work to do. The locked cabinet turned out to be easier than she'd expected, which bothered her more than if it had been difficult. A locked cabinet that's genuinely protecting something gets maintained. The lock gets oiled. The key stays on the person most invested in what's inside. This one had a lock so stiff from disuse that when Naomi found the spare key hanging on a nail behind the doorframe, exactly where someone confident nobody was looking would leave it, the mechanism resisted her for almost a full minute before it gave with a sound like a small complaint. Mercer wasn't worried about the cabinet because he wasn't worried about anyone looking. That told her something important about how he saw the people around him. He'd gotten comfortable. Comfortable enough to be careless with the details. That was her opening. She pulled the older ledgers at 6:30 in the morning, before anyone else was in the office, and spent 90 minutes with them before she heard footsteps on the porch. By the time Mercer arrived at 7:20, she was sitting at her desk reviewing the current quarter's invoices, with a pencil in her hand and an expression of mild professional concentration, and the older ledgers were back in the cabinet exactly as she'd found them, right down to the angle of the spine on the top binder. What she'd found in those 90 minutes was worse than she'd expected. Not because the fraud was more elaborate, it was roughly what she'd anticipated. The same system extended backward through time with the quiet confidence of something that had never been challenged. What was worse was the scale. 2 years of records. Consistent, methodical, invisible to anyone not specifically trained to find it. Wage theft, supply manipulation, and underneath both of those, something that had taken her the last 20 minutes of her window to begin understanding. A pattern in the land records that she needed more time to trace. Someone wasn't just stealing money. Someone was laying the groundwork for something larger. She needed those land records. And those weren't in the cabinet. She asked Dolan about them that afternoon, framing it as a routine question about fixed asset documentation for her organizational system. He scratched the back of his neck and told her the land deeds and territorial filings were kept in the main house, in Mercer's private office. "Is that standard?" she asked. "Having the land records separated from the financial records?" Dolan looked at her like the question was slightly too sharp. "I don't handle the paperwork side," he said. "That's Mercer's department." "Of course," she said. "Thank you, Dolan." She watched him walk away and thought about the land records sitting in a room she had no legitimate reason to access, and about the patterns she'd started to see in what little she had, and about the fact that she was in a position she'd been in before, knowing something was wrong, needing more information to prove it, and having to move carefully enough that she didn't alert the person capable of making her disappear from this job the way the last two bookkeepers had disappeared. The difference this time, she reminded herself, was that she wasn't alone, or at least she had reason to believe she might not be. She found Luke at the end of the day near the equipment barn, replacing a broken hinge on the door with the methodical patience of a man who believed in doing a thing properly, or not at all. She stood back and watched him work for a moment before he acknowledged her without turning around. "You found something," he said. "Several somethings." She moved closer and lowered her voice. "I need to see the land records, the ones in Mercer's office." His hands stilled on the hinge. "That's a problem." "I know it's a problem. I'm telling you it's necessary." She paused. "The wage irregularities go back at least 2 years, but there's also something in the supply records, purchases that don't match any inventory I can account for. Equipment that was invoiced and paid for but doesn't exist on the property. That kind of money doesn't just disappear into someone's pocket. It gets moved, transformed into something else." He turned to look at her then. His expression was careful. "Land," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The hinge hung half-installed in his hand. "You're saying he's buying land," Luke said slowly, "with money stolen from the ranch." "I'm saying that's what the pattern suggests. I need the deed records to confirm it." She met his eyes. "You told me not to bring things to Mercer. You told me you'd tell me who to bring it to when the time was right. I'm telling you the time is getting close to right." He set the hinge down on the barrel beside him and looked at the ground for a moment with the expression of someone doing arithmetic on something other than numbers. "Give me 3 days," he said. "What happens in 3 days?" "I'll have access to what you need." He picked the hinge back up. "Don't go near Mercer's office. Don't ask anyone else about the land records. And don't write down anything you've found yet." She felt a flash of irritation. "I'm not going to—" "I know you're not careless," he said, and there was nothing condescending in it, just directness. "But paper can be found. What's in your head can't be taken from you." He looked at her. 3 days, Naomi." It was the first time he'd used her name. She noticed it without meaning to. 3 days, she said. She spent those 3 days doing 2 things simultaneously, being visibly, unthreateningly competent at her stated job, and building in her mind the most complete picture she could assemble from the records she already had access to. The wage theft, she now estimated, had extracted somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 from the ranch workers over 2 years, taken in increments small enough to be invisible to any individual worker comparing his wages to what he thought he'd earned. 40 men who worked hard physical labor in a place without a union or an advocate, most of them without enough formal education to audit their own pay stubs, even if the thought had occurred to them. The supply manipulation was more sophisticated. False invoices from suppliers that were either fictitious or complicit, routed through Mercer's approval process with no secondary verification, paid out of ranch accounts he controlled completely in the owner's prolonged absence. Some of the money almost certainly went to those phantom suppliers. Some of it went somewhere else. She also, during those 3 days, began paying more careful attention to the ranch hands themselves. Not to the work they did, but to the conversations they had, and more particularly to the ones that stopped or shifted when Mercer walked past. She had good ears, and she'd learned years ago that the most accurate information about any operation came not from its official records, but from the way people talked around the edges of what they weren't saying. What she gathered, pieced together from fragments. 3 men had left the ranch in the past year, all described as having moved on with the same flat phrase Dolan had used with her. 2 of those men, she learned their names, Pete Grawl and a hand called Sutter, had apparently raised questions about their wages before leaving. The third had not raised questions, but had left in a hurry after being seen in conversation with the previous bookkeeper. The previous bookkeeper. A woman named Elise, according to a young hand named Cody, who mentioned her name once and then went quiet when he realized he'd said it. Naomi didn't push. She stored it. On the second evening, she crossed the yard at dusk and noticed Luke in conversation with 2 of the older hands, men she hadn't learned the names of yet. And something about the arrangement of their bodies told her it wasn't casual. They were standing close, faces angled inward, voices too low to carry. When she walked past at a distance, none of them looked up, which itself was slightly odd because men on working ranches generally notice movement. On the 3rd morning, Mercer called her into his office. She sat across his desk with her hands folded and her breathing even, and he looked at her with that practiced warmth that never quite reached anything authentic. "How are you settling in, Miss Carter?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "The records are well organized. Whoever set up the original filing system did good work." He smiled. "I designed that system myself." "It shows," she said, "a real efficiency to it." His smile widened slightly. She kept her face pleasant and open. "I wanted to check in about your progress," he said. "See if you had any questions." "Nothing I can't handle," she said. "Though I did notice the supply invoices for the spring of 2 years ago seem to be missing a secondary receipt log. Is that something that was kept separately?" She watched his face. The smile didn't drop. It adjusted. Just barely. Just for a fraction of a second. A small muscular recalibration that told her more than anything he was about to say. "Those older auxiliary records aren't always kept," he said smoothly. "At that scale of operation, the primary invoice is considered sufficient." "Of course," she said. "That makes sense." She stood to go. At the door she paused, like she'd just thought of something minor. "Oh, one other thing. I'll need to reconcile the fixed asset records eventually. Is there a good time for me to look through the property documentation, just for the depreciation schedules?" This pause was longer, fractionally, but measurably. "I'll pull those together for you," he said. "Give me a week or so to locate everything." "Absolutely, no rush," she said, and smiled and left. Walking back across the yard, she made herself breathe slowly. He was going to use that week to prepare those records, to make sure whatever she saw was a version he controlled. She needed Luke to come through. Now. He found her that evening. She was at the fence again. She'd taken to walking that line at the end of the day, partly for the air, and partly because it was the one place on the property where she could think without feeling like someone might be watching the angle of her eyes. He came up alongside her in that way he had of appearing without announcement, like he'd been there slightly longer than she'd noticed. "The land records," he said. "I have them." She stopped walking. "How?" "I had copies made when the original deeds were filed." He said it simply. "Some time ago. I'll bring them to you tonight, after 10. She looked at him. "Luke?" "Yeah." "Who are you?" she asked. Not aggressively. Just directly. The way she did most things. Because a ranch hand doesn't keep copies of land deed filings. A ranch hand doesn't tell the new bookkeeper who not to trust before she's had time to earn that kind of warning. And a ranch hand doesn't have the kind of information you seem to have access to. The evening light was flat and yellow out here, the kind that made shadows longer than they should be. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see something working behind his eyes. The same calculation she'd noticed the first time they talked. The sense of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to say and was deciding whether to say it yet. "I'm someone who needs what you're finding," he said finally. "The same way you need what I have. That's enough for now." It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough, and he knew she knew it. But she also knew that pushing harder in that moment would gain her nothing except a closed door. 10 o'clock, she said. "I'll knock twice," he said. The documents he brought her were not just copies. They were originals. Or rather, they were the kind of copies that get made when someone with legal authority has access to the filing office, careful reproductions on proper paper with proper stamps. She'd seen documents like this before, in her father's records, before everything went wrong. She sat at the small table in her room with the lamp turned low and went through them while Luke stood by the window with his arms crossed, not watching her work but not leaving either. What she found took her 40 minutes to trace fully, and when she was done, she set the last page down and sat back and stared at the wall. "He's using shell transactions," she said. "There are 3 separate land parcels that have been... The ownership has been structured so that the recorded holder is a business entity, not a person. A land company registered in the territorial capital." She looked at Luke. "But the money that capitalized that company came from Blackstone operating accounts. I can trace it through the supply invoice overpayments." Luke's jaw was tight. "How many acres?" "Combined?" She did the calculation. "Close to 4,000, parcels that border Blackstone on the north and western edges." She looked at him carefully. "Land that borders a ranch tends to have one practical purchaser above all others." "The ranch itself," he said. "Which means whoever owns this ranch..." She stopped. looked at him. He was very still. Whoever owns Blackstone, she said carefully, should own those parcels. They should be purchased on behalf of the ranch and recorded accordingly. But they're not. They're recorded under a holding company that has nothing formally to do with Blackstone Ranch. Except that the money came from Blackstone, Luke said. Exactly. She folded her hands on the table. So either the owner of this ranch authorized these transactions through some structure I'm not seeing, in which case this gets complicated. He didn't, Luke said. You're sure? Yes. She held his gaze. How are you sure, Luke? He unfolded his arms and pulled the chair from the corner and sat down. And for the first time since she'd met him, he looked something other than composed. Not distressed, exactly. More like a man who'd been carrying a weight long enough that the decision to set it down had become its own kind of effort. Because it's my ranch, he said. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from the window frame. Outside, the ranch was quiet. She didn't respond right away. She let that sit in the air between them and just breathed through it. You're Lucas Grayson, she said. Yes. The owner. Yes. She looked at him. At the worn work shirt, the calloused hands, the sun-weathered face she'd assumed belonged to a man who'd spent his life in other people's employ. And you've been living out here as a hand. For 7 months, he said, since I started suspecting Mercer. I couldn't get clean information from the outside. Every report I commissioned came back managed. Contractors hired to audit were given access to the documents Mercer wanted them to see. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The only way to see what was actually happening was to be inside it. That's... She stopped. Reckless? He offered. I was going to say it's exactly what I would have done, she said. And then, because she was honest even when honesty was inconvenient, I'm angry that you didn't tell me. I know. I walked into this situation without knowing who I was actually working for. That matters. You're right, he said. It does. And I'm sorry for that. No excuses packaged around the apology. Just the apology itself, sitting there without ornamentation. She looked at the documents on the table. The land records, the deed copies, 2 years of carefully accumulated evidence of someone helping himself to another person's inheritance, one transaction at a time. He's stealing your land, she said. He's been stealing everything. Luke's voice was even. The money, the wages of good men who earned them, the property. And he's doing it patiently, which is the worst kind of theft because you don't notice it until enough is already gone that stopping it gets complicated. She understood that better than she wanted to. She'd watched the same kind of patient theft consume her family's ranch. The paperwork had looked clean right until the moment it didn't, and by then the men holding the correct documents had all the power, and her father had nothing. Who else knows, she asked. Who knows you're here? No one on the property. He paused. I have a contact in the Territorial Land Office, a man I trust, but I haven't gone to him yet because I don't have enough to make it stick. Mercer has connections in the local courts. If I go with incomplete evidence, he ties it up in legal process for years and disappears, whatever I haven't already secured. She nodded slowly. This was the part she understood with her whole body. Incomplete evidence presented too early didn't just fail. It warned the person you were building a case against that the case was coming. Then we keep going, she said. He looked at her. We. You need what I know how to do, she said. I can read these records the way Mercer can't anticipate, because he doesn't understand accounting the way someone who grew up inside it does. He understands the crude structure, but not the granular patterns. She gathered the documents into a careful stack. And I need what you have, which is authority when we're ready to use it, and access to the people in this territory who can actually do something with what we find. This isn't safe, he said. If Mercer realizes what we're doing, he realizes I'm here and he doesn't feel threatened by me yet, she said. That window isn't permanent. We need to use it while we have it. Luke looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between gratitude and concern, and something else she deliberately didn't try to name. All right, he said. They built the system over the next 2 weeks with the kind of disciplined, careful collaboration that Naomi had only ever experienced once before, working alongside her father before the ranch was lost, and she was still learning what she was capable of. It was different from that, obviously. Her father had been teaching, and Luke was not her father, and this was not a lesson. But there was something in the rhythm of it, Two people who thought in different but complementary ways working toward the same point that felt like a language she'd forgotten she knew. She handled the financial reconstruction. Every evening in her room with the lamp turned low and a code system they'd devised together for naming documents, she built a parallel ledger, a true accounting of what the ranch had earned, what it had spent, what had been stolen, and where the discrepancy between those numbers had traveled. It was painstaking work. It was also the kind of work she was genuinely, deeply good at, the kind that required a certain type of mind that could hold a large structure in place while examining a single brick, never losing the architecture while testing the mortar. Luke handled the people. She watched him do it, carefully, from a distance, because she understood now that he was as deliberate about being watched as she was, and drawing obvious attention to their collaboration would undo everything. But she saw it in pieces. A conversation with the older hand, Reuben, that went on longer than any social exchange should have needed to. A quiet word with Cody, the young hand who'd let slip Elise's name, after which Cody started walking with slightly better posture, like something had been resolved for him. An evening meeting she was not part of and not meant to know about, in the equipment barn, that involved at least 6 of the ranch's 40 hands and produced the following day a quietly different atmosphere in the yard. Men who'd been wary and separately so suddenly feeling, she thought, less alone. He was building trust. Carefully, without announcing it, he was making sure that when the time came, the people on this property would know whose side to stand on. She asked him about it one evening at the fence line because she'd been thinking about it for days, and there was no productive reason to keep it to herself. "They already trust you," she said. "The men. They look to you." "Some of them," he said. "More than some." She paused. "How long did it take?" He thought about it. The trust or the noticing that they did? Either. The trust came fast with some people and slow with others, he said. Reuben took about 3 months before he'd say anything real to me. Cody was 2 weeks. He shrugged in that minimal way he had. People know when someone's actually paying attention to them. It's not common enough out here that they miss it when it happens. She thought about her father, who had been that kind of man, genuinely paying attention to his workers, his neighbors, his family. It had made people love him, and it had also, she sometimes thought, made him too willing to believe people loved him back when some of them were only pretending to. "You have to be careful with that," she said. "When people trust you, they don't always think about whether it's wise to." He looked at her. "Is that from experience?" "My father was trusted by everyone in 3 counties," she said, "including the man who ended up holding the papers that took the ranch." Luke was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your family's land." "It was 5 years ago," she said. The words came out flatter than she'd intended. "I've been sorrier for longer periods of time, and I'm done with that as a primary activity." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that suggested a smile had considered appearing. "You're not done with it, though," he said. "You're just not letting it sit still." She looked at him sharply, because that was a more accurate reading than she generally allowed people. "The fraud that took your ranch," he said, not unkindly. "That's why you're still working at midnight on someone else's stolen ledgers, not just because it's right, because it's yours too, in a way." She held his gaze for a long moment, deciding whether to be irritated or honest. "Yes," she said, "in a way." The crack in the operation appeared on a Tuesday, and it came not from where she'd been watching, but from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Cody came to the office door in the early afternoon, nervous in a way that was immediately obvious to anyone who'd been paying attention to the baseline. He waited until she was alone and then stepped in and closed the door behind him with the exaggerated caution of a young man who'd never done anything genuinely dangerous and wasn't sure he wanted to start now. "I need to tell you something," he said. She kept her voice level. "Sit down, Cody." He sat. He laced his fingers together and unlaced them. "Mercer asked me to start keeping track of your hours," he said. "What time you come in, what time you leave, which records you're pulling." The room was very quiet. "When did he ask you?" she said. "This morning." He looked at his hands. "He said it was routine, that he did it with all the bookkeepers." A pause. "But he didn't do it with the last 2. I was here for both of them, and he never asked me anything like that." So Mercer had been watching her settle in and had decided she warranted surveillance. The question was whether that was because he'd seen something specific that alarmed him, or whether it was routine escalating suspicion. And the answer to that question mattered enormously. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That I would." Cody looked up. "I haven't yet. But if I don't give him something, he's going to wonder why." She thought for approximately 4 seconds. "Then give him something," she said. "Tell him I pulled the spring inventory records yesterday. Tell him I seem satisfied with what I found and I've been focused on organizing the current quarter's payables." She met his eyes. "That's true enough that it won't read as fabricated, and none of it will help him." Cody nodded. He stood to go and then stopped. "Miss Carter, the two before you—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I know," she said. "I'm being careful." He looked like he wanted to say more and couldn't find the words for it, and then he left, and she waited until his footsteps had faded entirely before she let out a slow breath and allowed herself one moment of pure, clean fear. Just a moment, just enough to acknowledge that this was real and the stakes were real, and Mercer was not going to stop on his own. Then she put the fear in the same drawer she put everything that wasn't immediately useful, and she went back to work. That evening she told Luke about Cody. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for long enough that she knew he was rearranging something in his own calculations. "He's feeling the pressure," Luke said. "Mercer." Something made him nervous. "My question about the older supply records," she said, "or the question about the land documentation. Either one could have done it. Or both." Luke turned and looked toward the main house. "He's going to move faster now. Whatever he was planning to do with those land parcels, he's going to try to formalize it before we can challenge it." "Then we need the wage evidence fully documented," she said. "Everything I can prove independently of the land records, because the land piece requires a territorial filing challenge, and that takes time. But stolen wages, if I can hand that to the right official with documentation solid enough to withstand his lawyers, that's immediate. That's something people go to jail for." "The men who are shorted," Luke said, "they'll need to verify it. Some of them, a representative sample. 3 or 4 men who are willing to say what their actual hours were, with their employment records." She looked at him. "Will they?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." She believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she'd seen the way those men looked at him, and she'd seen, this past week especially, the way something had shifted on the property, some low-grade tension replacing itself with a quieter, more purposeful feeling. Luke had been talking to these men, preparing them, she now understood, for exactly this. "We have maybe 2 weeks," she said, "before Mercer figures out what I'm actually doing." "Then we use 2 weeks," he said. She nodded. Outside the window, the cattle moved in the last of the light, slow and indifferent as always, and above them the sky went the color of an old bruise healing, purple at the edges, dark blue at the center, and stubbornly, gradually clearing. She went back inside and pulled the lamp close and opened the next binder, and her pencil began moving across the paper with the steady, patient rhythm of someone who had learned a long time ago that the truth was always there, if you were willing to look long enough and hard enough and refuse, no matter what, to look away. The 2 weeks she'd estimated turned into 11 days. On the 11th day, Mercer called a ranch-wide meeting in the yard and announced, with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he was still the smartest person in any room he entered, that due to a territorial tax reassessment, all ranch wages would be temporarily reduced by 15% effective the following pay period. He framed it as a shared sacrifice. He used the word temporary 3 times. He looked at each cluster of men in turn with that practiced warmth and managed, Naomi thought, to appear genuinely regretful about something he had almost certainly been planning for months. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched the faces of the men. Some of them accepted it the way working men in that era often accepted bad news from authority, with a flat, exhausted resignation that came from years of understanding that argument was expensive and compliance was survivable. But some of them, the ones she'd noticed gravitating toward Luke these past weeks, exchanged glances of a different quality, not resigned, alert. Luke himself was standing near the equipment barn, arms at his sides, face completely neutral. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, which she'd come to understand was itself information. The more still he was, the more was happening underneath. After Mercer dismissed the gathering and walked back toward the main house with Dolan, she waited a full 10 minutes before moving toward the barn. Luke was still there, adjusting something on a harness that didn't appear to need adjusting. 15%, she said quietly. I heard. That's not a tax reassessment, she said. There's no territorial tax structure that would produce that kind of ranch-specific wage impact. None made it up. I know he made it up. She looked at him. He's accelerating. Whatever timeline he had, he's moving it forward. She paused. Which means he either found something or he suspects we're close. Luke set the harness down. Or both. He turned to face her. How complete is the wage documentation? 80%, she said. I need Ruben's employment records from the first quarter of last year, and I need the corrected time logs from the waterline work. After that, I have enough to present a complete picture going back 22 months. I can have those records to you by tonight, he said. Ruben kept his own logs. A lot of these men did after a while. They started noticing the discrepancies themselves. They just didn't know what to do about it. She felt something tighten in her chest at that. Men keeping their own careful records because they knew they were being cheated and had nowhere to take it. How many of them have their own documentation? 7? Maybe 8? That's not 80%, she said. That's a complete case. He almost smiled again. The almost smile she'd gotten accustomed to, the one that lived at the very edge of his expression and never quite committed. Then we're close. We're close, she agreed. And Mercer just told us he's running out of patience, so we need to move before he does something that changes the landscape. She was thinking about the land parcels, about the holding company, about whatever mechanism Mercer had been building to formalize his theft before anyone could challenge it. A 15% wage cut looked to her like a man raising cash, not for taxes, but for a transaction, something he needed to fund quickly. I need to see the land filings one more time, she said. Tonight, he said. Come to the tack room at 10. The tack room at 10 o'clock was cramped and smelled like leather and neat's foot oil and the specific dusty warmth of a space that absorbed decades of working animal. Luke had a single lantern on the workbench and 3 men besides himself when she arrived. Ruben, who was somewhere in his 50s with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who thought before he acted in all things. A man named Harlan she'd seen around the property but not spoken to directly. And Cody, who was sitting on an upturned bucket and looked like he'd lost a night's sleep, but was determined not to mention it. Ruben handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle without being asked. She unwrapped it on the workbench and found a set of hand-ruled ledger pages, written in the careful, slightly oversized script of a man who'd taught himself to write and took the process seriously. Time logs, dates, hours, work categories, signatures where he'd had a partner present to confirm. 22 months of documentation, almost perfectly parallel to what she'd been reconstructing from the official records. She looked up at him. You've been keeping this the whole time. Started when Pete Grawl left, Ruben said. Pete said his last wages were short. We worked the same crews. I checked my own, and sure enough. He shrugged, one shoulder. A man ought to know what he's owed. Yes, she said. He ought to. She spent 20 minutes going through his pages against the mental map she'd built of the official logs, checking alignments, noting where the official record diverged from the handwritten truth. The divergence was consistent, predictable, and damning in its clarity. Luke watched her work. The other men watched Luke. It was such an established dynamic by now that nobody seemed conscious of it. When she was done, she looked up. I have what I need, she said. The wage case is complete. Every discrepancy, every stolen hour, 22 months of systematic underpayment with both official records and independent verification. She looked at Luke. But I need to talk to you about the land before we decide what to do next. Ruben, Harlan, and Cody read the room correctly and found reasons to be elsewhere within about 45 seconds. She was grateful for that. She spread the deed copies on the workbench, the ones Luke had brought her nearly 2 weeks ago, and pointed to the series of transactions she'd been tracking. He filed an amendment, she said, 3 days ago. I saw it processed through the post office. I'd asked Dolan to let me handle the outgoing territorial correspondence as part of my organizational system, and he agreed without thinking much about it. She traced the transaction chain with her finger. This holding company, Westmark Land Associates, just recorded a purchase agreement on a parcel that borders Blackstone's North Range, 1,200 acres. The funding source is buried in 4 layers of transfer documents, but I can trace it directly back to the fraudulent supply invoice payments. Luke's face had gone very still. He's not just skimming anymore, she said. He's making a move. This purchase, combined with the parcels he's already acquired, would give Westmark control of the primary water access on the North Range. She looked at him directly. If that transfer completes, whoever holds those water rights can effectively determine what the North Range is worth. And given that Blackstone's North Range is the most valuable grazing land on the property, he's positioning to force a sale, Luke said. His voice was flat. Not loud. Just flat. He steals enough to buy the water rights, then uses the water rights to depreciate the land value until I have to sell or operate at a loss. And Westmark buys it, she said, at the depreciated price, which he funded with money stolen from you in the first place. The lantern threw long shadows across the workbench. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the adjacent stable, and the sound of it, that ordinary animal, middle-of-the-night sound, was somehow the wrongest thing about the whole moment. Everything normal continuing around something that was absolutely not. When does the purchase agreement complete? Luke asked. 30 days from filing, she said, unless it's challenged. 27 days now. Yes. He was quiet. She watched him absorb it, not in the way some men absorbed bad news, with noise or movement, but in the way he did everything, inward and still, like a deep current running under calm water. Then we don't have 2 weeks, he said. We have days. We need to go to your territorial contact, she said, the one at the land office. We need to go now, with what we have. What we have is strong on wages and circumstantial on land fraud, he said. Mercer's lawyers will argue the holding company is a legitimate separate investment. We need the direct financial link between Westmark's funding and the Blackstone account theft to be absolutely unambiguous before— It is unambiguous, she said, and she said it with the particular quiet force of someone who knows what they're talking about and is not in the mood for equivocation. I've built the chain. Every transfer, every fictitious invoice, every supply payment that went to Westmark's precursor accounts. It's documented. It will hold. He looked at her. Luke, she said, I have been doing this my entire adult life. I watched my family lose everything because the documentation on our side wasn't tight enough, because the person building our case didn't understand what a territorial court needed to see. I understand it. This will hold. A long moment. All right, he said. It came out rougher than usual, like something had to move to let it through. We go to Harlan Morrison. Your contact. He's the deputy registrar at the Territorial Land Office in Caldwell. 2 days' ride. He looked at her. I need to go myself. If I send someone else with documents from an anonymous bookkeeper, it's easy to dismiss. If Lucas Grayson walks in with the evidence in hand, you reveal yourself, she said. Yes. And Mercer finds out. Eventually, yes. He met her eyes, which means we need to be ready for what he does when he finds out. This was the part she'd been circling in her mind for the past 3 days, ever since she'd seen the land filing come through. The moment Luke revealed himself publicly, Mercer's entire strategy collapsed, but only if they'd moved fast enough to get the evidence into official hands first. If Luke revealed himself before the evidence was secured with territorial authorities, Mercer's first move would be to destroy whatever he could and deny the rest. And his second move, she suspected, would be directed at her. He'll come after me, she said. It wasn't self-pity, it was operational assessment. I'm the one who built the financial case. If he can discredit me or remove me before we can present it, I know, Luke said. I need copies of everything in a location he can't access, she said. Not here on the property. I know. And I need— She stopped. I was looking at her with an expression she wasn't used to seeing on him. Not the careful neutrality or the almost smile, but something more unguarded. Something that looked like the face a person makes when they've been worried about something for a while and have decided it's time to say so out loud. You need to be somewhere he can't reach you while I'm in Caldwell, he said. I'm not leaving the property, she said immediately. If I leave, it looks like flight. It gives him grounds to tell everyone I took documents and ran. It destroys the credibility of everything I've built. I know that too, he said, which is why I need you to do something that is going to be harder than anything you've done so far. She waited. Stay visible, he said. Keep working. Give him nothing to react to while I'm gone. He paused. And trust me to come back. The lantern flickered. The horse shifted again. She thought about the last time she'd trusted someone to handle the piece she couldn't control herself, and about how that had ended, and about the fact that Lucas Grayson, owner of Blackstone Ranch, richest man in the territory, was not her father's fraudulent business partner, and was not Silas Mercer, and had spent 7 months living as a working hand among his own employees because he cared enough about the truth to do it the hard way. "How long?" she asked. 4 days? Maybe 5. She nodded. "Go," she said. "I'll still be here." Something moved across his face at that, too brief to name. Then it was gone, and he was reaching past her to gather the deed copies into the oilcloth they needed to travel in, and the moment closed, and they were back to the work. He left before dawn the next morning. She knew he'd gone because at 6 o'clock when she crossed the yard, Cody was doing the fence check Luke usually did, with the careful mimicry of someone who'd been given instructions and was determined to follow them exactly. She said nothing. She went to the office. She opened the current quarter's payables and started working. For 2 days, nothing happened. This was, she understood, its own kind of tension. The complete absence of incident when you were expecting one had a particular quality, a tautness, like a rope pulled to just before its breaking point, vibrating in a wind you couldn't see yet. She worked. She was pleasant to Mercer at their brief daily check-ins. She was thorough and unhurried in everything she did. She ate her meals. She slept, in the abbreviated, hyper-aware way she'd been sleeping since she'd arrived. On the 3rd day, Dolan told her Mercer wanted the current quarter's expense reports consolidated by end of week, ahead of schedule. He said it was for an external review, Dolan said, and he had the tone of a man repeating words he didn't quite believe. "Of course," she said. "I'll have them ready." She consolidated the expense reports. She made them accurate and clean and completely uninformative about anything she'd actually been doing. It took most of the day, and she spent it thinking about what external review meant in Mercer's context, and concluded it probably meant he was preparing materials for whoever his accomplices were in the Westmark transaction, making sure the official Blackstone financials told a story that supported his version of events before anyone started asking questions. He was preparing for discovery. He knew something was moving. On the 4th day, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. The first was that Cody knocked on her office door at mid-morning and passed her a folded note without a word. She opened it under her desk. "Back tomorrow. Everything is in place. Be ready." She burned the note in the office stove that was used for document disposal and kept working. The second thing was that Mercer came to the office in the afternoon and sat down across from her desk in a way he hadn't done before. Not standing and visiting, but sitting, settling his weight, arranging himself with the deliberateness of a man who'd decided this conversation was necessary and had thought about how to have it. "I want to be direct with you, Miss Carter," he said. "Please," she said. "I've been made aware that you've been asking questions beyond your immediate responsibilities," he said, "about land records, about older operational histories." He held her gaze with that practiced warmth, and underneath it now, for the first time, she could see the structure of it, the mechanism, the way a man looks when the warmth is a tool and not a feeling. "I want to make sure you understand what your role here is." "I'm the bookkeeper," she said. "My role is to maintain accurate financial records." "Exactly," he said. "Accurate current records. The historical materials you've been curious about are outside that scope." He paused. "I'd also be remiss not to mention that your predecessor, the woman who had this position before you, made similar overreaches. It put us in a difficult position and ultimately led to her departure." She kept her face completely neutral. "I appreciate you being direct," she said. "Can I ask what specific concern you have about my work to date?" A flicker. Barely there, but she caught it. He hadn't expected the question turned back on him quite that calmly. "No specific concern," he said. "A general reminder of appropriate scope." "Understood," she said. "I'll keep my focus on the current accounts." He stood. At the door he paused, and this pause felt different from his usual theatrical ones, less controlled. "I should also mention," he said, "that in Mr. Grayson's continued absence, I've been authorized to make personnel decisions as needed." She looked at him steadily. "Of course," she said. He left. The door closed. She sat very still for about 30 seconds, which was how long it took the controlled calm to pass through its necessary cycle and come out the other side as something colder and more useful. He just threatened to fire her. Politely, plausibly, with an exit already prepared. Similar overreaches, difficult position, departure. If she was gone before Luke returned, the case she'd built went with her, because Luke didn't have her particular grasp of the financial architecture, and without her to present it, the documents were a pile of numbers with no interpreter. She had one day. She spent that night doing something she'd been putting off because it felt like admitting a vulnerability she didn't want to admit. She wrote everything up. Not just the numbers were already documented, but the narrative, the complete account of the fraud, how it worked, how she'd found it, what each document proved, and how. Written in plain, clear language that someone without accounting training could follow, because the audience for this document might eventually be a jury or a judge or a room full of territorial officials who needed to understand what had been done to whom. She wrote until 2 in the morning, then she copied it, by hand, 3 times. 3 copies of the full narrative, plus the complete financial documentation. She wrapped one set in oilcloth and put it under a loose board in her room that she'd identified in her first week as a previous occupant's hiding place. She gave a second set to Reuben the next morning when he came past the office door, in a bundle that looked like laundry, with instructions she delivered in 20 words or less. The third set she kept on her person. Then she went back to the office and opened the current quarter's payables and waited for Luke to come back. He arrived at mid-afternoon, riding in through the main gate with the dust of 2 days' hard travel on him and an expression that was, even by his standards, difficult to read. She saw him from the window and kept working until he'd had time to settle the horse and wash the road off his face. Then she walked across the yard to the tack room and waited. He came in 5 minutes later. "It's done," he said. "Harlan filed the challenge to the Westmark purchase agreement this morning. The territorial registrar has the wage documentation. They're sending an investigator." She let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 4 days. "How long until the investigator arrives?" "A week, maybe 10 days. Mercer threatened to fire me yesterday," she said. He went still. "What did he say exactly?" She told him. Verbatim. She had a good memory for the things that mattered. Luke listened with his arms crossed and a muscle working in his jaw that he wasn't quite suppressing. "Then we don't have 10 days, he said. "No," she agreed. "I need to reveal myself," he said, "before he makes a move on you. If you reveal yourself now, before the investigator arrives, he'll know the filing happened," she said. "He has enough connections that he could try to interfere." "He'll try to interfere regardless," Luke said. "At least if I'm publicly the owner, he can't fire you. He doesn't have the authority." She thought about that. I was right, technically. A personnel decision made by an operations manager was reversible the moment the actual owner was present and countermanded it. If Luke stepped forward now, Mercer lost his most immediate weapon. "But he might run," she said. "He won't run," Luke said, and there was a certainty in it that surprised her. "Mercer doesn't run. He spent 7 years building this scheme. He believes he's protected." He paused. "He has a relationship with Judge Calver in the county court. He thinks Calver can make anything local disappear." She filed that away. A judge. She'd been wondering about the protective layer underneath Mercer's confidence, the reason a man running this level of fraud could feel secure enough to be careless with locked cabinets and spare keys. "Then we need to make sure the evidence is already at the territorial level before Calver can be involved," she said. "It is," Luke said. "As of this morning." She nodded slowly. "Then reveal yourself," she said. "Tonight, if possible, before he has time to do anything with what he said to me yesterday." "Tonight," he agreed. She looked at him, the dust still on his collar, the tiredness around his eyes that he was ignoring, the set of his jaw that was the same whether he was mending a fence or dismantling a years-long fraud. She thought about the night in the tack room and the folded note and the 4 days of careful, visible normalcy she'd maintained while the most important pieces moved. "You should have told me who you were from the start," she said. "Not accusatory now, just true." "I know," he said. "I would have helped you anyway." "I know that too," he said. "Now." She didn't push it further. "Some things you said once and let stand." She told him the truth and he'd received it, and that was enough. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "The holding company, Westmark." He looked at the floor for a moment and then back at her. "I had Harlan do a full corporate trace through the territorial filings." A pause. "Mercer isn't the sole principal." The tack room was very quiet. "Who else?" she asked. Judge Calver," he said. "He's a 20% partner in Westmark Land Associates." There it was, the layer she'd suspected without being able to name. The protection Mercer had been relying on. A judge who wasn't just corruptible, but actively invested in the fraud itself. A man who could dismiss any local challenge, redirect any county-level inquiry, provide legal cover for manufactured land transfers because the proceeds were partly coming to him. She sat with that for a moment. Let it settle into the full architecture of what they were facing. This wasn't just an operations manager stealing from his employer. This was a system. A small, careful, territorial system built to steal land from ranchers who didn't have the resources or the knowledge to fight back. How many other ranches? How many other working families? Her family? She didn't say the last question out loud, but it was there, and Luke saw it on her face because he was watching her with that careful attention he brought to everything. "We don't know yet how far it goes," he said quietly. "Calver's been on the county bench for 11 years. 11 years. She did the math she didn't want to do and stopped herself. "One thing at a time," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "One thing at a time," he agreed. That evening, Luke Grayson called a meeting of all the ranch hands in the main yard. Mercer was present. Dolan was present. Every man on the property was present, gathered in the cooling air with the particular attention that assembles when people sense that something is about to be different. Luke stood in the center of the yard. He'd changed his shirt, still a work shirt, still plain, nothing that announced itself. But he'd washed the road off completely, and he stood with his full height in a way that he'd been, she now realized, consciously moderating this entire time. "My name is Lucas Grayson," he said. He said it the way he said most things, simply without theatrical buildup. "I own this ranch. I've been working among you for 7 months as a hand because I needed to understand what was happening to this operation from the inside." The yard was completely silent. "What I found," he said, "is that the men on this property have been systematically underpaid for over 2 years. That money was stolen by the operations manager with the knowledge and assistance of a partner in the county court system." He looked at Mercer directly. "The evidence has already been filed with the territorial authorities. An investigator is on the way." Mercer's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, none of them the practiced warmth. The first was disbelief. The second was rapid calculation. The third, and this was the one that confirmed everything, was a look he directed at Naomi. Not at Luke, at Naomi. Because he'd known, on some level, that the threat was coming from the numbers. He'd felt it, warned her, threatened her. He just hadn't known in time. "This is absurd," Mercer said. His voice was almost steady. Almost. "I don't know who you are or what fabrication this woman has put together, but I have 17 months of wage records that say otherwise," Luke said, cross-referenced with independent documentation kept by 8 of your current employees. He paused. "And I have the Westmark corporate filing with your name and Judge Calver's name on it." The name Calver landed in the yard like a stone dropped into still water. A visible ripple went through the assembled men, not because they'd known, but because they heard the shape of what it meant. A judge. Of course. Of course there was a judge. Mercer said nothing. The calculation behind his eyes was moving fast. She could see it, looking for the exit, running the angles, trying to find the version of this where he still had options. She stepped forward. Not dramatically, just close enough to be clearly included in what was happening. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "the territorial filing is already done. The copies of every document are in 3 separate locations off this property. There is nothing left to destroy." He looked at her. That smile was completely gone. What was underneath it was considerably less charming. "You have no idea," he said very quietly, "what you've just done." "I have a very precise idea," she said. "That's rather the point." Dolan, to his credit, stepped back from Mercer at that moment and crossed his arms and looked at the ground in a way that suggested he'd suspected something for a while and was done pretending otherwise. The rest of the men, 40 working hands who'd been watching, listening, doing the private accounting that men do when they realize they've been cheated, were very still. Then Reuben, who was standing near the back of the group, said clearly, "How much did he take from us?" Naomi answered him directly because he deserved a direct answer. Across all the men on this property, over 22 months, approximately $9,400 in stolen wages. The number went through the yard like a physical thing. Luke watched Mercer. Mercer looked at the ground, at the fence, at the horizon. Everywhere except at the 40 faces of men who were now looking at him with the particular dangerous quiet of people who have just understood the size of what was done to them. "You'll stay on the property until the investigator arrives," Luke said to Mercer. "If you leave, that's evidence of consciousness of guilt, and I will make sure the territorial marshal knows it within the hour." He held Mercer's gaze. "I'd advise you not to test that." Mercer said nothing. He turned and walked toward the main house with the rigid, precise movements of a man who was focusing every remaining resource on not letting anyone see how frightened he was. Naomi watched him go. She thought about Silas Mercer at his desk with his practiced warmth and his careful smile. She thought about two bookkeepers before her who'd been pushed out of this job when they got too close. She thought about Pete Grawl and Sutter, who'd said something about their wages and then disappeared from the employment rolls. She thought about Elise, whoever Elise was, and hoped she was somewhere safe and had landed on her feet. She thought about her father in the final weeks before the ranch was lost, sitting at the kitchen table with documents spread in front of him, and that specific look on his face. Not of a man who's defeated, but of a man who's realized too late that the fight was already lost before he knew it was happening. She hadn't been able to help him then. She'd been 29 and still learning the full shape of what she knew how to do, and by the time she understood it completely, there was nothing left to save. But she was here now. And this time, the documents told the truth. And this time, the truth was already somewhere safe where no one could undo it. Luke came to stand beside her, not close enough to be conspicuous, just near enough. "You all right?" he said, very quietly. She considered the question honestly, which was her habit. "Not entirely," she said, "but enough." He nodded, which was his way of accepting an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. The yard was still moving around them, men talking in clusters now, the contained energy of people processing a shock, the specific agitation of working men who'd learned what they were owed and were starting to think about what that meant. Reuben was talking to Harlan. Cody was standing by himself near the fence, looking at his hands with the expression of a young person encountering a genuine injustice for the first time and finding it both worse and more comprehensible than he'd imagined. "Judge Calver," Naomi said. "The investigator will go after him?" "The territorial filing includes the corporate trace," Luke said. "Calver's involvement is documented." "He'll fight it," she said. "A man on the bench has tools available that Mercer doesn't. He can slow it, challenge the filing process, create jurisdictional complications." "He can try," Luke said. "He will try," she said. "Luke, this isn't over when Mercer confesses. This is over when Calver can't do to someone else what he did to—" She stopped herself. He looked at her. "To your family," he said. She hadn't told him the details. She'd said enough, in fragments, over the past 2 weeks, that he'd assembled the shape of it, if not the specifics. She could see that he had. "I don't know that Calver was involved with what happened to the Carter Ranch," she said carefully. "No," he said. "But you're going to find out." She looked at him. "When this is done," he said, "when the investigator has what he needs, and Mercer is in the territorial system, and Calver is under scrutiny, you look into it. I'll help you." She held his gaze for a moment and felt something that was complicated and unwelcome, an entirely real shift somewhere in her chest. Not gratitude exactly, not what she'd been expecting to feel in this moment. Something more structural than that. The sensation of weight being distributed differently than it had been, after years of carrying everything on one side. "One thing at a time," she said, the same thing she'd said to him in the tack room. "One thing at a time," he agreed, and this time there was something in the way he said it that was almost, the full smile she'd never quite seen from him. The yard settled gradually into evening around them, the sky doing its daily performance in orange and deep blue above the hills, the cattle indifferent in the distance, the lanterns in the bunkhouse coming on one by one. Tomorrow an investigator was coming. Mercer was in the main house with nowhere to run. Judge Calver didn't know yet that his name was already in a filing 200 miles away. The men on this property had finally heard a number that explained a feeling they'd been carrying for 2 years. and Naomi Carter, who had arrived in Red Hollow with $17 and a folded job advertisement and a particular kind of fury she'd been carrying since the day her family's land was taken, stood in the yard of Blackstone Ranch and let the evening settle over her without moving, and breathed and waited to see what came next. Mercer made his move at 4 in the morning. She heard it because she hadn't been sleeping. She'd been lying in the dark, running numbers in her head the way she always did when something was unresolved. And the sound that came through the thin wall of the ranch house wasn't loud, just wrong. A drawer closing with too much care. Footsteps that were trying not to be footsteps. She was at her door in under a minute, and the hallway was empty, but there was a sliver of lamplight under the office door that had no reason to be there at this hour. She didn't go in. She stood in the hallway and breathed and thought, and then she went back to her room and got the third copy of the documentation, the one she'd kept on her person. And she moved it from the inside pocket of her coat to the inside of her boot, which was less comfortable and considerably safer. Then she went to the window and looked out at the yard. A horse was saddled at the rail near the equipment barn, saddled and loaded with 2 bags across its back. She had approximately 4 minutes, she estimated, before Mercer was back in the hallway with whatever he'd gone for and on his way to that horse. She used 2 of those minutes to cross the yard in the dark and wake Luke, who was in the bunkhouse in the corner bunk he'd occupied for 7 months, and apparently slept about as lightly as she did because he was sitting up before she'd finished the first knock. "He's running," she said through the door. She heard him stand. The door opened 15 seconds later. "The horse at the east rail," he said. "Yes." He was already moving past her, and she followed because it wasn't in her nature to stand in one place while events happened elsewhere. They crossed the yard at a pace that wasn't quite running. Running produced noise, and noise was the one thing they couldn't afford yet. And Luke went to the horse and simply untied it and led it quietly to the far pasture gate and let it through, and then came back and rehung the reins on the rail so that in the dark it would look, for about 30 seconds, like nothing had changed. Those 30 seconds were what they had. Mercer came out the side door of the main house carrying a leather satchel and moving with the focused urgency of a man who'd made his decision and was past reconsidering it. He was halfway to the rail when Luke stepped out of the shadow of the equipment barn directly into his path. Mercer stopped. The yard was lit by nothing but stars and a half moon, and the light was enough to see by, but barely. Luke stood with his hands at his sides and said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. The missing horse said it for him. "You moved my horse," Mercer said. His voice was flat. The warmth was completely gone now. Had been gone, she suspected, since the yard meeting the evening before. What was left underneath it was not the face she'd seen across the desk for 3 weeks. This was older and harder and considerably more willing. "I did," Luke said. "That's my horse." "Everything on this property is mine," Luke said, "including that horse." Mercer looked at the satchel in his hand. A calculation ran visibly across his face. The assessment of what he was holding, what was in it, what it could do for him if he could get far enough fast enough. Naomi stepped out from behind the barn on his left side. She didn't say anything either. She just stood there, which was enough to complete the geometry. I was between them, without a horse, in the dark, with a satchel that would look, in any legal proceeding, exactly like what it was. "I'd like to know what's in the bag," she said. "That is none of your—" "I'm the bookkeeper," she said. "If it's financial documentation from this ranch, it falls under my professional purview." She held out her hand, not demanding, not aggressive, just steady. "Mr. Mercer." He looked at her hand. He looked at Luke. He looked at the gate where his horse wasn't, and the road beyond it that was still just a road going somewhere he could no longer reach. He put the satchel down on the ground. She crouched and opened it. Inside were 3 things. A set of ledger pages she recognized immediately as the original supply invoice records, the ones she'd been working from copies of, a bound folder that turned out to contain the Westmark corporate documents, including the founding agreement, and a smaller envelope that held what appeared to be correspondence. She didn't read the letters in the dark, but she could see the letterhead on the topmost one. Judge Harold Calver, County Court, Territorial District 7. She looked up at Luke. He nodded once. "You'll go back inside," Luke said to Mercer, "and you'll stay there until the investigator arrives." He paused. "You just made this considerably worse for yourself, taking these. You understand that." Mercer was quiet for a long moment. In the starlight, he looked older than he had in the office, smaller, not in a satisfying way, in the way that all people look smaller when the architecture of a thing they've built is finally fully visible, and the building turns out to be a prison with themselves inside it. Calver will bury this, he said, not with confidence, with the tone of a man saying something he'd been telling himself for months, and wasn't sure he believed anymore. Calver's name is already in a territorial filing, Luke said. Whatever he does locally, it's too late to make it disappear. Mercer picked up the empty satchel and walked back to the house. His footsteps on the porch steps were deliberate and unhurried, which was, she thought, the last performance he had left in him. She stood up with the documents and the folder and the envelope of letters, and held them against her chest and exhaled slowly. 3 in the morning, she said. 4, Luke said. Close enough. She looked at the letters. We need to read these. Inside, he said. I'll get the lamp. The correspondence between Mercer and Calver went back 4 years. They sat across from each other at the office table with the lamp between them, passing pages back and forth in silence, except for the occasional sound of paper turning. And by the time they were done, the room had a particular kind of stillness that descends when you've read something that confirms what you suspected, while also being, somehow, worse than you'd prepared for. It wasn't just Blackstone. That was the thing. It was never just Blackstone. The letters documented 8 separate ranching operations in the territory that had been subjects of what Calver called, in his own handwriting, managed transitions, a phrase that took on its full ugliness in context. Ranches struggling with debt or succession disputes or drought damage that had suddenly found themselves in legal proceedings before Calver's court, proceedings in which manufactured documentation had appeared, filings had been manipulated, and the outcomes had consistently favored a small collection of land speculators with connections to Westmark and its predecessor entities. 8 ranches, 8 families, 8 separate quiet catastrophes disguised as legal process. Naomi set the last page down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. My family's ranch, she said, the Carter property in Millhaven County. She kept her voice level. That would have been in the Millhaven County Court, not Calver's district. No, Luke said, but the same structure. She wasn't asking. The letters don't mention Millhaven specifically, he said, but the structure they describe, the manufactured legal disputes, the land speculation network, it's larger than Calver's district. He mentions partners, plural. She had known this on some level since the moment she'd read the Westmark corporate filing and seen Calver's name. Known it the way you know things you're not ready to know yet, and store them carefully in a back room of your mind until you have the capacity to look at them directly. Her family's ranch hadn't been bad luck or bad judgment. It had been a system, a coordinated, profitable, careful system for taking land from people who didn't have the legal tools to protect themselves. Her father hadn't failed. He'd been targeted. Naomi, Luke said. She looked up. Are you all right? No, she said. Same answer she'd given him last night, same honesty. But I will be. She gathered the Calver letters into a careful stack. These go with the territorial filing, today. We can't wait for the investigator. These need to be in official hands immediately because Calver may already know Mercer tried to run, and if he does, he'll start managing whatever he can manage from his end. I'll write at first light, Luke said. 4 hours, she said, looking at the window where the dark was still complete. I'll have everything organized before you leave. He looked at her across the lamp. She was aware of how tired he was, 4 days of hard writing, and now this. And she was aware of how tired she was, running on abbreviated sleep and sustained adrenaline, and the specific energy of a person who's been at high alert for so long, it started to feel like her baseline. You could sleep for 2 hours, he said. The letters will still be here. So will I, she said. Let me work. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, and she expected him to go back to the bunkhouse, but instead he pulled the other chair around to her side of the table and sat down next to her, not intrusively, just near, and picked up the first of the supply invoice originals and began organizing them by date. She looked at him. 2 sets of hands are faster than 1, he said, without looking up. She looked back at her papers and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't either too much or not enough. And she'd learned over her 34 years that some things you simply let stand. They worked through the remaining dark in that way, side by side in the lamplight. and it was the most ordinary, extraordinary thing she'd experienced in a long time. Luke left at 6 with everything packaged in oilcloth and 2 spare horses in case one went lame. Naomi watched him go from the porch of the main house and then went inside and made a decision she'd been turning over since 4 in the morning. She was going to talk to Dolan, not because she trusted him completely. She'd never been a person who trusted completely, it wasn't in her construction, but because Dolan was the structural middle of this operation. He wasn't complicit the way Mercer was. She was reasonably confident of that. What he was a man who'd been managing a working ranch under a corrupt superior and had chosen, consistently, not to look too hard at things that didn't directly concern his immediate responsibilities. That was its own kind of failure. But it wasn't the same failure, and she needed him functional and on the right side of this for the next several days. She found him at breakfast in the cookhouse, eating with the quiet concentration of a man who used meals as a thinking space. She sat across from him without preamble. "I need to tell you what's going to happen," she said, "so you're not surprised by it." He looked at her over his coffee. "Go ahead." She gave him the short version. Investigator arriving within a week. Mercer confined to the property. Territorial filing already complete and including evidence that would not be reversible. Judge Calver under scrutiny at the territorial level, meaning local court intervention was not going to help anyone. Dolan listened without interrupting. When she was done, he set his cup down and was quiet for a moment. "The Calver piece," he said finally. "That's the part that concerns me." "It should concern everyone," she said. "No, I mean—" He stopped, started again. "Calver has 2 men. Associates, I guess you'd call them. They've been out here twice in the past year, talked with Mercer. Sir, I didn't know what about." He looked at her. "Big men, not court officials, the kind of men a judge shouldn't have working for him." She kept her face still. "Can you describe them?" He described them. She committed the descriptions to memory and felt something cold and practical move through her thinking, because what he was describing, and Dolan was not a man given to exaggeration, were not administrative associates. They were the kind of men you hired when you needed a problem to stop existing. "Have they been here recently?" she asked. "Not in 2 months," he said. "But if Calver knows something's happening, he'll send them," she said. "That's what I'd expect," Dolan said. He looked at the table. "Miss Carter, I want you to know I didn't understand what Mercer was doing, not the full shape of it." She looked at him. He was genuinely uncomfortable, which was appropriate, and not making excuses, which she respected. "What did you understand?" she asked. Not punishingly, just honestly. "That the wages weren't always right," he said. "I told myself it was accounting errors. I told myself it wasn't my department." He rubbed the back of his neck. "That's not a defense. I know it's not. But I want you to know I didn't know about the land." "I believe you," she said, which was true as far as it went. "Right now I need you to do your job. Run this ranch. Keep the men working. Don't let anything that happens in the next week disrupt the operation. The cattle still need feeding regardless of what's happening in the main house." He nodded. Something in him settled slightly. Having a concrete task, she'd observed, was what men like Dolan did best with. The ambiguity of the past weeks had been its own kind of weight on him. "And Dolan," she said, "if 2 unfamiliar men ride onto this property in the next several days, you send for me immediately. You don't talk to them, you don't let them near the main house or the office, and you make sure there are always at least 3 other men present." He looked at her steadily. "You think he'll send them?" "I think we should be ready in case he does," she said. "And I think ready is better than surprised." She left him to his breakfast and walked back across the yard and thought about Calver's men the whole way, and about what it meant that Mercer was currently sitting in the main house with nowhere to go and a head full of knowledge about what had been filed with the territorial authorities, and about the fact that a desperate man with access to a communication line was a variable she couldn't fully control. She went to the office. She found the telegraph account records. Blackstone had a wire account through the Red Hollow post office for business communications. And she pulled the outgoing log for the past 48 hours. 1 outgoing wire. Sent yesterday afternoon, while she'd been in the cookhouse and Luke hadn't yet returned. She read the destination code twice to make sure she had it right. Then she went to find Reuben. "I need you to ride to Red Hollow," she told him. "Right now. I need you to go to the post office and ask the clerk whether a wire was received yesterday afternoon, addressed to District 7 Court, and if so, whether a response was sent. Reuben looked at the piece of paper where she'd written the outgoing code. His face did the slow, careful thing it always did when he was processing something serious. "Mercer warned Calver," he said. "That's what I believe," she said. "I need to know if he responded, and if so, what was said." "The clerk won't tell me what the wire said." "He won't tell you," she agreed. "But if you ask whether it was received and responded to, and he hesitates before answering, that's enough. And if he confirms a response was sent, note the time." Reuben put the paper in his chest pocket. "I'll go now." "Take Cody," she said, "and ride straight back." She watched him go and then stood in the yard for a moment with the sun fully up now and the ranch making its ordinary morning sounds around her, and she thought about the chessboard quality of what was happening. Mercer confined but not silent, Calver warned and presumably reacting, Luke on the road to the territorial capital with documentation that could bring down an 11-year scheme, and herself standing here as the only fixed point, the only one who had the full picture in her head and couldn't afford to lose her grip on any part of it. She was tired. She was genuinely, bone-deeply tired in a way she hadn't let herself feel until just this moment. She went inside and drank a cup of coffee standing at the kitchen window and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of being tired. Then she put the cup down and went back to the office. There was still work to do. Reuben was back in under 3 hours. The answer was yes. A response had been sent within 2 hours of Mercer's wire, which meant Calver had been ready for exactly this kind of communication and had not needed time to think. She didn't have the content of the response. She didn't need it. The speed of it was content enough. She called a meeting in the TAC room at noon. Reuben, Harlan, Cody, and 2 other hands she'd identified over the past weeks as men who were both trustworthy and steady under pressure. 6 people who knew enough of the situation to be useful without knowing details that would put them at risk. "I need you to understand what might be coming," she said. She kept it plain and straightforward because these men didn't need to be managed and she didn't have the energy to try. "The operations manager has communicated with a judge who is part of the same scheme. We don't know what that communication produced. We do know the investigator is coming within the week, and the territorial filing is already in official hands. Our job between now and then is to ensure this ranch stays secure and no one on it is intimidated or interfered with." Harlan, who was a big man and generally quiet, crossed his arms. "You think Calver sends someone?" "I think we're prepared in case he does," she said. "I need at least 2 men at the gate at all times. No unfamiliar visitors without me or Dolan present. No one goes anywhere alone." "You think they'd hurt someone?" Cody asked. She looked at him. He deserved an honest answer. "I think men who've been running this kind of operation for 11 years don't become cautious at the moment they're most threatened," she said. "I think we take it seriously." Cody nodded. His jaw was set. I was scared. She could see it. And he was deciding not to let it make him useless, which was the best thing you could do with fear. "One more thing," she said. "If anything happens to me or to the documentation in my room, anything. Reuben knows where the 3rd set of copies is. Reuben, if I tell you to go, you go immediately, without waiting to ask questions. You understand?" Reuben looked at her for a long moment with those slow, measuring eyes. "I understand," he said. She dismissed them and sat alone in the TAC room for a few minutes after they'd gone, in the leather and oil quiet of it, and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just said out loud. "If anything happens to me." She'd said it as a logistical contingency because it was one. She wasn't going to perform bravery she didn't feel by pretending the risk wasn't real. But she was also, she recognized, not particularly afraid. Not in the immobilizing sense. More alert than afraid. More focused than anything else. She'd walked into this territory with nothing and built something that could not be easily unmade, and if Calver sent men to try to unmake it, they were going to find that considerably harder than intimidating a bookkeeper with nowhere else to go. She was not that bookkeeper anymore. Calver's men arrived on the 3rd day. 2 of them, exactly as Dolan had described. They came in the early afternoon on horses that had been ridden hard, and they came through the gate before the hand on watch could do more than call out to them, which told her they were people who didn't wait for permission as a general practice. She was in the yard when they arrived. She'd been in the yard quite a lot over the past 3 days. Visible, unhurried, present, giving anyone watching from outside the property no reason to think that Blackstone Ranch was anything other than a working operation going about its normal business. The larger of the two men swung down from his horse and looked around the yard with the particular manner of someone assessing a space for tactical purposes, which wasn't subtle and wasn't meant to be. His partner stayed mounted. Both of them had the look of men who'd been hired to convey something and had chosen their appearance as part of the message. "I'm looking for the bookkeeper," the large one said. To no one in particular, which was also a choice. "That's me," she said from where she was standing 20 feet away. He turned, looked at her with an expression that recalibrated only slightly upon seeing that the person he was looking for was a woman in her 30s who met his gaze without blinking. "Judge Calver requests a meeting," he said. "Today, in Red Hollow." "That's a nice way to put it," she said. She let a beat pass. "Tell me why the judge would like to meet with a bookkeeper." "He's conducting an informal inquiry into some territorial filings," the man said. "Your name came up." "I'm sure it did," she said. "I'm afraid I can't leave the property today. I'm in the middle of a financial audit, and the documentation is too sensitive to leave unattended." She smiled pleasantly. "Please give my regards to Judge Calver and let him know I'm happy to cooperate with any formal request through the appropriate territorial channels." The man's expression didn't change much, but something behind it shifted. "The judge would prefer an informal conversation first." "I'm sure he would," she said. "But I'm a professional woman with professional responsibilities, and I prefer formal channels. They create a record, which is helpful for everyone." Reuben materialized at her left elbow. Harlan appeared near the barn gate. 3 other hands were visible in the periphery of the yard, not gathered, not aggressive, just present in the specific way that changes the arithmetic of a situation. The large man looked around the yard slowly, did his assessment again, came to some conclusion. "The judge isn't going to be pleased," he said. "I expect he isn't," she said. "Have a safe ride back." They left. She watched them go until the dust settled on the road beyond the gate, and then she stood very still for a moment because her hands were shaking slightly, which she hadn't noticed while it was happening and noticed acutely now that it was over. Reuben said very quietly, "You want to sit down?" "I want to finish what I was doing," she said. And after a moment the shaking stopped, because she didn't need her hands calm to think, and thinking was what this moment required. Calver had just told her 2 things by sending those men. First, that he knew exactly who she was and what she'd done, which meant Mercer had given him considerably more information than just a warning. Second, that he was still trying to manage this locally. An informal conversation, no record, the kind of meeting where things could be said and denied and where a woman without obvious backing could be reminded of her vulnerability. He didn't know Luke was back. She went to find Mercer. I was in the main house sitting room, which was where he'd been spending most of his time since the yard meeting 3 days ago. Not confined in any physical sense, just with nowhere to go and nothing to do except wait and think. She'd been watching him the way you watch a variable you can't fully control, and what she'd observed was a man in the specific process of calculating whether cooperation or resistance was still the better play. She sat across from him without invitation and put her hands in her lap. "Calver sent men today," she said. "I assume you know that." He looked at her. He was tired. Not the managed tiredness of a man performing humility, actual, worn-through tiredness, the kind that comes from holding a large lie in place for a long time and finally letting it down. "Yes," he said. "You told him more than that we'd filed," she said. "You told him about me specifically." He didn't deny it. That was, she thought, the first genuinely honest thing he'd done in however many years. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I want you to understand that. Calver's name is in the territorial filing alongside yours. The correspondence between you is in official hands. The investigator is coming regardless of anything Calver does locally." She paused. "What matters now, for you specifically, is the difference between what happens if you cooperate with the territorial investigation and what happens if you don't." Mercer looked at the window. Outside the yard went on being a yard. "Calver will say the correspondence is fabricated," he said. It wasn't an argument. It was more like a man testing out loud whether he still believed his own defenses. "The correspondence is in your handwriting and his," she said, "on court letterhead. The territorial document examiner will authenticate it in approximately 1 afternoon." He was quiet. "Silas," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name, because this was a different kind of conversation than any they'd had before. 8 families lost their ranches. I know about 8 in the letters. There may be more. Those people deserve an accounting. She held his gaze. You can give it to them, or you can let this go to full proceedings and lose control of how your part in it gets told. Something moved through his face. Not remorse exactly. She wasn't going to pretend it was remorse. More like the final collapse of a calculation that had been failing for a while. Calver runs deeper than what's in the letters, he said. She didn't move, didn't react, even though something electric went through her entire chest at those words. Tell me, she said. He told her. It took 40 minutes. She didn't take notes. She'd learned a long time ago that note-taking during a voluntary disclosure stopped some people from saying the full thing, made them conscious of the words as they left and therefore more careful with them. She listened. She stored it, all of it. When he was done, the room was very quiet and the afternoon light was going golden through the window, and she had in her head a picture considerably larger than anything the letters alone had shown her. Calver wasn't just a partner in Westmark, he was the architect. He'd been running manufactured land fraud across 3 territorial districts for a decade, using a network of operations managers, compliant surveyors, and crooked court clerks to identify vulnerable ranches, create legal pretexts for disputes, and systematically transfer land to speculator interests in which he held hidden stakes. Mercer was one of 4 operations managers he'd been running simultaneously. The others were in Dawson County, in the Pinon Valley Territory, and in a district called Red Mesa, 200 miles south. 4 ranching territories, 11 years, dozens of families. And somewhere in that network, she was now almost certain, was the mechanism that had taken the Carter Ranch. She stood up. She needed air, and she needed a moment, and she needed Luke to be back before she did anything else. I'll need you to repeat all of that, she said, when the investigator arrives, in writing, under oath. Mercer looked at his hands. And in exchange? I'm not a prosecutor, she said. I can't offer you anything formal. But what I can tell you is that the difference between a man who cooperates completely and a man who makes this harder is significant, and the people making those decisions will know which one you were. He nodded. Once. She walked out of the sitting room and through the main house and out the front door and stood on the porch in the late afternoon air and let the sighs of what she'd just heard settle over her like cold water. 4 territories, 11 years, dozens of families. Her family. She stood there until she could breathe normally. It took a few minutes. When she could, she went back inside and began writing everything Mercer had told her in the clearest, most precise language she knew. Because by the time the investigator arrived, she needed to have it organized well enough that nothing could be missed, misunderstood, or dismissed. She was still writing when Luke rode back into the yard just before dark. She heard his horse and the particular sound of a man dismounting after a long ride. And she heard Cody say something in the yard and Luke's voice respond, and then his footsteps on the porch. He opened the office door and looked at her at the desk with papers spread in front of her and a lamp burning close, and she looked up at him. How did it go? She asked. The investigator leaves Caldwell tomorrow morning, he said. 2 deputies with him. Harlan Morrison's filing has been formally accepted and the Westmark challenge is officially in process. He looked at her expression. What happened here? Sit down, she said. I have quite a lot to tell you. He sat. She told him. She was organized and sequential and left nothing out, and his expression as she spoke moved through several things that she noted without commenting on. The tightening around his jaw when she got to Calver's men, the stillness that deepened when she described Mercer's full disclosure, and something harder and more complicated when she got to the part about the network spanning 4 territories in 11 years. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. 4 operations managers, he said. That's what he said. And he'll testify to it. He will, she said. He has nothing left to protect and he knows it. Luke was quiet. He had his elbows on his knees and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who'd expected something significant and found something considerably larger. Naomi, he said, the Carter Ranch, Millhaven County. I don't know yet, she said. I need access to Calver's full records. His court filings going back. She stopped. I need to see what he controlled and what cases went through his network and whether Millhaven was part of it. The territorial investigators will have subpoena power over his records, Luke said. I know. I'll ask them specifically to look for it, he said, when they arrive. She looked at him across the desk, in the lamplight, after everything that had happened in a day that had started at 4 in the morning with a man trying to sneak away on a saddled horse. He was dusty from 2 days of riding, and she had ink on her left hand, and neither of them had slept more than a few hours in the past 72. And she was, despite all of that, calmer than she'd been in years. Not happy, exactly. Not at peace. The thing about justice, she'd learned, was that it didn't feel like resolution when it was happening. It felt like work. Necessary, painstaking, unbeautiful work that had to be done correctly, or it wasn't worth doing at all. But she was not afraid of work. She never had been. The investigator arrives in 2 days, she said. I need to have Mercer's disclosure organized and the wage documentation fully cross-referenced before he gets here. And I need the Calver letters indexed with a summary narrative that makes the full picture clear without requiring the investigator to reconstruct it himself. That's 2 days of work, Luke said. Yes, she said. So we should probably start. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been learning to read over the past weeks. The one that lived between steadiness and something warmer that he didn't push to the surface but didn't entirely suppress either. You haven't slept, he said. I slept 3 hours, she said. I'm fine. 3 hours is not... Luke, she said, I will sleep when this is done. Right now I need to work, and I need you to either help me or let me be. He was quiet for a beat. Then he pulled his chair around to her side of the desk, the same way he'd done in the dark 4 days ago, and picked up the first of the Calver letters. Tell me how you want these indexed, he said. She told him. They began. Outside, the last of the light gave way entirely, and Blackstone Ranch settled into the thick dark of a clear territorial night, cattle somewhere in the distance and stars overhead in their indifferent abundance. And in the office window, a single lamp burned steady and small against all of it. The specific light of 2 people doing something that mattered, in the way that mattered, at the cost it cost. It was not clean, it was not without consequence. But it was, page by careful page, becoming the kind of truth that could not be made to disappear. The investigator's name was Edmund Briggs, and he was not what she'd expected. She'd constructed, in her mind, the image of a territorial investigator as someone formal and procedural, the kind of man who moved through legal process the way water moves through a pipe, functionally, without particular feeling about where it went. What stepped off the horse at Blackstone Ranch's gate on a Tuesday morning was a compact man in his late 40s with a worn leather case under his arm and the kind of eyes that had seen enough human dishonesty to no longer be surprised by it, but still, evidently, minded. He shook her hand the way Dolan hadn't on her first day, with actual pressure, actually looking at her. Miss Carter, he said, Deputy Registrar Morrison speaks highly of your documentation. The documentation speaks for itself, she said. That's rather the point of good documentation. Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. I'm going to want to see all of it, he said, in sequence. It's organized in waiting, she said. Come inside. She'd spent the 2 days since Mercer's disclosure doing what she did best, building a structure so clear and complete that a person of reasonable intelligence could walk through it and arrive at only one possible conclusion. The wage theft, the supply fraud, the Westmark transactions, the Calver correspondence, Mercer's verbal disclosure, transcribed, signed, and witnessed by Rubin and Harlan, the corporate trace, the full financial chain from stolen ranch funds to land speculator accounts. Everything sequenced, everything cross-referenced, everything with a summary page at the front that told you where to look to confirm each claim. It had taken her most of 48 hours. She'd slept a combined total of perhaps 7. Luke had been beside her for most of it. Not doing her work, he understood his limitations and she understood hers. And he was not an accountant, but handling the things she couldn't handle while she was building the case. He'd managed Mercer, who had spent 2 days in a particular limbo that she thought was probably appropriate for a man in his position. He'd talked to the men, keeping the ranch operational and the mood from tipping into something unmanageable. He'd made sure food appeared near the office at intervals, which she'd eaten without looking up from the pages. She hadn't thanked him for any of it in the moment because there wasn't time and because he wasn't doing it for thanks. She'd noticed it, though. She noticed most things. What? Briggs spent 6 hours with the documentation on the first day. He read carefully and systematically and asked precise questions that told her he was genuinely following the financial logic rather than just cataloging documents. His two deputies, meanwhile, took Mercer's formal statement in the main house sitting room, a process that apparently lasted 3 hours, and produced a document that one of the deputies brought to Briggs with an expression that suggested it contained more than they'd anticipated. Briggs read it at the office table while she watched him from the corner of her eye. When he was done, he set it down and looked up. "He's giving us the other three," he said. "The other three operations managers," she said. "Yes, that was my understanding from his disclosure. He's also naming 2 surveyors and a court clerk in Dawson County." Briggs looked at the papers with the expression of a man reconfiguring the size of what he's dealing with. "This isn't one ranch, Miss Carter." "No," she said. "It isn't. This is going to take considerably longer than a week," he said. It wasn't a complaint, more like a man taking an accurate measurement. "I know," she said. "I'll be here." He looked at her with those worn, still-minding eyes. "Morrison told me how you found this, that you came in as a bookkeeper and built the case from inside." "It was the most direct route to the evidence," she said. "It was also considerably dangerous," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It was." He held her gaze for a moment. "The territorial attorney is going to want to talk to you at length," he said. "You'll likely need to testify." "I'm prepared for that," she said. And she was, in the practical sense. The documentation supported everything she would say, every number was verifiable, the chain of evidence was intact. But she also knew that testifying meant standing in a formal proceeding and saying out loud, under oath, in front of men who had reasons to discredit her, everything she'd found. It meant being a woman with a name and a face and a history that Calver's lawyers would attempt to use against her. She was prepared for that too. She'd been preparing for it, in some ways, since the day her family's ranch was lost. Calver was arrested on a Thursday. She wasn't there when it happened. It was territorial marshals who did it, in the county seat, while she was at Blackstone reviewing the corrected wage calculations with Briggs. Luke got the wire from Harlan Morrison at midday and brought it to the office without announcement, setting it on the desk beside her without interrupting what she was doing. She finished the calculation she was on and then read it. The words were plain and official and bureaucratic in the way important news often is. Judge Harold Calver, taken into custody this morning. Charges filed under territorial fraud statutes. 2 additional court officials held pending inquiry. She read it twice. Set it down. "All right," she said, "not to anyone in particular, just to the room." Luke was standing by the window. He looked at her without saying anything, which was the right thing, because there wasn't a thing to say that would have been adequate, and he knew it. She sat there for a moment with the wire in her hand and thought about her father. Not the way she usually thought about him, with the specific ache of loss that had dulled over 5 years, but never quite gone flat, but differently. She thought about what he would have done with this moment. He'd been a man who felt things openly, which she'd inherited less of than she sometimes wished. He would probably have cried, a little, and not been embarrassed about it. She didn't cry, but she let herself feel the full weight of what the wire said, without putting it somewhere useful or turning it into the next task. She gave it the 60 seconds it deserved. Then she put it down and picked up her pencil and went back to the wage calculations, because Calver being arrested was not the same as the work being done, and the work still needed doing. It took 3 more weeks to complete the formal documentation phase of the territorial investigation. Briggs and his deputies were thorough in a way she respected. They didn't rush toward the dramatic conclusion. They built the foundation correctly even when it was slow. She worked alongside them every day, answering questions, clarifying document chains, occasionally finding something in their own review that they'd missed, and walking them back through it without making anyone feel foolish about the missing. The ranch ran around all of it. Dolan, to his credit, managed that with a competence she hadn't fully appreciated before, keeping 40 men and 17,000 acres of working cattle land functional, while the main house was effectively an investigation office for 3 weeks. She told him so directly one afternoon, and he looked at the ground in the way he had of receiving a compliment, which was to appear mildly inconvenienced by it. "It's what I do," he said. "It is," she said. "And you do it well." He nodded and went back to work, which was also what he did. The men, The 40 hands whose stolen wages had started all of this were paid their arrears in the third week out of an account Luke had established specifically for this purpose. The amounts were not enormous, individually. $8 for one man, $14 for another, $37 for Reuben, who had worked the most hours on the most documentably underpaid categories of labor. But the way the men received those wages told her something she'd suspected and found confirmed. It wasn't just about the money, though the money mattered. It was about being seen, being counted, being told, in the only language a formal system has available, that what was taken from you was real and documented and wrong. Reuben held his payment and looked at it for a long moment. $37, he said. He wasn't being sarcastic. He was reading the number like a statement of fact that he needed to say out loud to believe. $37.40, she said. The 40 cents matters. He looked up at her. You calculated the 40 cents. I calculated every cent, she said. That's the job. He folded the payment into his shirt pocket with the same care he used for everything and said, Thank you, Miss Carter. Then he went back to work. She stood there after he'd gone and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the same neighborhood, the feeling of a thing done correctly, down to the 40 cents, and the difference that made. The Millhaven question came in the fourth week, the way she'd been waiting for it to. Briggs came to the office one morning with a folder she hadn't given him, something his deputies had pulled from the Territorial Archives subpoena on Calver's records. He set it on the desk in front of her and didn't say anything immediately. She opened it. Carter Ranch, Millhaven County, foreclosure proceeding 5 years prior. Presiding judge, District 7 associate, acting on referral from county bench. The referral, a single page, came from an office she recognized. The debt instrument that had triggered the proceeding was processed through a surveying firm she now knew was part of Calver's network. The creditor who'd acquired the Carter property at the forced sale was a landholding entity that shared a registered agent with Westmark Land Associates. She went through all of it twice, very carefully, the way she did everything that mattered. When she was done, the folder was still open on the desk and the room was very quiet. Briggs was still there, which she appreciated. He hadn't left to give her privacy, which would have felt like being managed. He just stayed, which felt like respect. It was the same system, she said. Her voice was steady. She'd had 5 years to build that steadiness, and it held when she needed it. It appears so, Briggs said. The debt instrument that triggered the proceeding was fraudulent. That's what the document chain suggests, yes. He paused. The territorial attorney will want to include it in the Calver proceedings. It means the Carter property should never have been sold, she said. The legal process of recovering it will take time, he said. There are subsequent transactions, title chains that have to be examined. But the foundation of the original proceeding was fraudulent, and if the documentation holds, it will hold, she said. He nodded. He picked up the folder. At the door, he stopped. Miss Carter, I've been in this work for 22 years. He seemed to be choosing his words with some care. I have seen a lot of documentation. I want you to know that what you built here, what you put together in a matter of weeks, from inside an operation that was actively concealing itself, is among the most complete and coherent cases I've examined. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. It came out simpler than she expected, without the professional deflection she usually reached for. He left. She sat at the desk with her hands in her lap and looked at the window and thought about her father again, about the kitchen table and the documents and the look on his face. And this time the thought didn't land like a wound. It landed like an accounting finally balanced, not restored, not undone, but balanced. She let herself have that feeling, all of it, for as long as it lasted. Luke found her at the fence line that evening, which was where she found herself when she needed to think without walls. She'd been standing there for about 20 minutes watching the cattle and the sky do their respective things, and she heard his footsteps on the dry grass before she heard anything else. He came and stood beside her. Not the half step behind he'd used in their first weeks, the position of a man being careful about his cover. Just beside her, level. Briggs told me about the Millhaven filing, he said. I figured he would, she said. How are you? She considered the question the way she always did, actually, rather than reflexively. I don't entirely know yet, she said. I think it'll take a while to land completely. That seems right, he said. It doesn't fix it, she said. I need you to know I understand that. Even if the legal recovery goes forward, even if the property is restored, 5 years is 5 years. My father is gone. That time doesn't come back. No, he said, it doesn't. I'm not looking for it to fix it, she said. I just needed to know the truth of it. What actually happened and why. She paused. I've known for 5 years that something was wrong with how we lost the ranch. I never had the evidence to prove it. I just had the feeling. She looked at the hills. The feeling was exhausting to carry. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality than usual. Not the measured steadiness of a man being careful, but something more unguarded. I hired 2 auditors before you, he said, after the first bookkeeper left, before I decided to come here myself. I told them what I suspected and I gave them access, and both times I got back a report that said everything was within normal parameters. He paused. I almost believed them the second time. I was tired of not believing them. She looked at him. I know what it costs, he said, carrying a thing you can't yet prove, staying with it when the easier choice is to let it go. She turned back to the hills. Why didn't you let it go? He thought about that. She'd noticed he didn't answer important questions quickly, which she'd come to recognize as a sign that the answer, when it came, was worth the wait. Because the men on this property were being cheated, he said. And because I knew it, and if I let it go, I was choosing comfort over what I knew was true. He looked at his hands. That's the kind of choice you can't make, and then forget you made it. She understood that precisely. It was the same reason she'd taken a job in Red Hollow with $17 in her pocket and a suitcase that weighed less than her pride. Not courage, exactly. More like an inability to do the other thing and live with herself afterward. Luke, she said. Yeah. I'm going to need to go to Mill Haven, she said. When this is settled enough that I can leave, I need to look at the property records myself and understand the full chain of what happened. I know, he said, and I need to look into whether there are other families in Mill Haven who were part of the same network, she said. The same manufactured debt instruments, the same referral system. If Calver's operation extended there, the Carter Ranch probably wasn't the only one. Probably not, he said. She turned to look at him directly. That's going to take a while. I expect it will, he said. She held his gaze. She was saying something and he was hearing it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise, which was the kind of honesty she valued more than almost anything. I'm telling you because I think you should know what you'd be, what this would look like going forward. It's not a clean situation. It's not going to be done in a month. Naomi, he said, I spent 7 months living in a bunkhouse pretending to be someone I wasn't in order to catch a man stealing from people who worked for me. Clean situations are not something I've been prioritizing. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, That's a fair point. The almost smile came, and then, for the first time, it finished. A full, unguarded, slightly tired smile that changed his entire face and made him look briefly like someone who'd stopped calculating and was simply present in the moment he was standing in. It was a good face, she thought, not a perfect one, a real one. She turned back to the hills. Tell me about Blackstone, she said. What it was supposed to be before all of this. He looked out over the land and something in him relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. My grandfather built the original house, he said. He came out here with nothing. Less than nothing, actually. He came out with debt. He worked someone else's land for 8 years before he had enough to buy the first parcel. He paused. He used to say the land didn't belong to anyone permanently, that you were a steward of it for the time you had it, and how you used that time determined whether you deserved it. He sounds like he was a good man, she said. He was particular, Luke said. Stubborn, didn't suffer foolishness. A pause. I've been told I take after him. She didn't comment on that because it was accurate and he knew it was accurate and neither of them needed to say so. What do you want it to be? She asked. Blackstone. Going forward. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, what it was supposed to be. A working ranch that pays working wages, that keeps its books honestly and its records clean, that doesn't take from the people who give it their labor. He looked out over the North Range. My grandfather never had trouble finding good men because good men knew what they were getting. I'd like it to be that again. She nodded slowly. You'll need a permanent financial director, she said. Someone who builds transparent systems from the start. Not just keeping the books, but designing them so that what happened with Mercer can't happen again. So the checks are built in, not dependent on any single person's honesty. I'm aware, he said, with the tone of a man who has been thinking about this exact thing. I'm not available immediately, she said. I have Millhaven. I'll wait, he said. She looked at him sharply. Not because the word surprised her. She'd understood for the past several weeks the direction of things. In the way you understand things that nobody has said but both people are aware of. She was startled, she thought, by the simplicity of it. No negotiation, no conditions, just, I'll wait. That's a long time to hold a position open, she said, because practical objections were the ones she defaulted to when emotional ones were too large to handle directly. I've been patient before, he said. I'm reasonably good at it. She looked at the hills again. The light was going in that deep, particular way of late evening out here, turning everything amber, and then copper, and then a color that didn't have a name but belonged specifically to this place, to this land, to the sky above 17,000 acres of ground that a man's grandfather had worked himself raw to earn and a subsequent generation was fighting to protect. I'll come back, she said. Not a promise exactly, more than a maybe. The truth of what she intended, stated plainly, which was the only kind of truth she dealt in. I know, he said. The formal proceedings took 4 months to move through the territorial legal system. Naomi was present for most of them, first as a witness, then as a civilian consultant to the territorial attorney's office, helping untangle the financial documentation for a prosecution team that was good at law but less fluent in the specific language of ledger manipulation. She didn't enjoy the formality of it, the way legal proceedings absorbed the texture of what had actually happened and transformed it into abstracted language and procedure. But she understood its necessity. The truth mattered, and so did the form in which it was officially recorded. Mercer testified. Fully, as he'd agreed, and more completely than she'd expected. He named not only the 4 operations managers and the Calver network, but 2 additional land speculators she hadn't been able to connect herself, men who'd been several removes from the direct fraud but had profited significantly from it. His cooperation did not make her feel charitable toward him, but it served the purpose it needed to serve, which was the only measure she was applying. Calver fought it. That was predictable. He hired the best territorial attorneys available, and they challenged the admissibility of the correspondence, the provenance of the financial documentation, and, she'd anticipated this, the credibility of the woman who'd assembled the case. There was a week during which she sat through a deposition that was designed to do one thing, make her seem like a motivated, unreliable woman with a personal grievance rather than a professional with demonstrable expertise. She sat through it with her hands folded and answered every question with the precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this for a very long time. She did not get angry in the room. She saved the anger for the walk back to the boarding house she was staying at in the territorial capital, where she covered 8 blocks at a pace that alarmed several pedestrians, and then stood in her room for 5 minutes breathing until the sharpness of it passed. Then she went back to work. The documentation held. Of course it held. She'd built it to hold. Calver was convicted on 7 counts of judicial fraud, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit land theft, and 2 counts that his own attorneys hadn't anticipated because they came from the Mercer disclosure and implicated a financial instrument that even the prosecution had initially missed. She'd found it on a reread of the territorial filings 3 weeks into the proceedings, flagged it to the prosecuting attorney, and watched it become the 7th count. She was in the courtroom when the verdict came in. She was in the back, not at the attorney's table. She wasn't the lawyer. She was the person who'd made the case possible for the lawyers. And when the verdict was read, she sat very still with her hands in her lap and felt something move through her that she couldn't entirely name. Not triumph, not closure, which was a word she'd always found suspicious in its tidiness. More like the particular exhaustion that comes after you've done something very hard and done it correctly, and the adrenaline has finally been given permission to leave. She was aware, sitting there, of everything that wasn't fixed by this moment. The years of stolen wages that had been partially repaid but couldn't give back what those years had cost their families. The ranches that had changed hands and would take years more of legal process to challenge. The families who'd moved on and built different lives in different places and might not ever know that what happened to them had been deliberate and documented and finally, officially, acknowledged as wrong. These were real limitations. She didn't paper over them with the fact of the conviction. But she also didn't discount what the conviction was. It was a thing that had not existed before and now existed. It was a record. It was an accounting. Her father would have understood that. The value of a correct accounting, even when it can't undo the past. Especially then. She went to Mill Haven on a Wednesday in early autumn, 3 weeks after the conviction. She went alone, which was her preference for this particular journey. Luke had offered, twice, with the straightforward directness that was characteristic of him. Not pressuring, just making the offer available. She'd told him honestly that she needed to do this part herself, and he'd accepted that the same way he accepted most things she said. Without argument and without wounded feelings, which was rarer than it should have been in a man. The Carter Ranch property was 12 miles outside Mill Haven, on a stretch of flat working land with a creek running along the eastern edge that had been, in her childhood, her favorite part of the entire property. She'd spent hours at that creek. The memory of it was one of the ones that had stayed cleanest over the years, undistorted by what had come after. The current holders of the property, a family named Tesler who'd bought it at a second sale 2 years after the forced transfer, were not bad people. She'd established that in her research before making the trip. They were a young couple with 2 children who'd invested everything they had in the land and were running it as a small cattle operation. They hadn't known about the fraud that preceded their purchase. They were, in their own way, victims of it. She didn't go to the property itself. She'd made that decision before she came, that the Teslers' home was their home, and appearing on their doorstep with a historical claim was not something she was willing to do without a legal framework that protected them as much as it addressed the injustice done to her family. That framework was in process. The Territorial Attorney's Office, with Briggs's active assistance, was working through the Mill Haven chain of title. It would take time. She went to the ridge above the creek instead, accessible from the county road, a piece of high ground that wasn't part of the deeded property but had been one of her father's regular riding spots. She could see the whole of the lower pasture from there, and the creek, and the roofline of the house a mile distant. She sat on a flat rock and looked at it for a long time. She didn't say anything out loud, which she'd never been in the habit of doing with the dead. But she thought about her father. Really thought about him. Not the abstracted grief shape of him that she usually kept at a managed distance, but the actual person. The way he'd looked at this land. The way he'd talked about his grandfather and his own grandfather. The chain of people who'd worked this ground and made it mean something. The way he'd taught her to read a ledger, sitting at the kitchen table with her on a Saturday afternoon. Not because he thought she'd need it for work, but because he thought understanding numbers was understanding the truth of things, and the truth of things was worth knowing. She sat there until the sun moved enough to change the light on the pasture, and then she stood up and walked back to the road and felt, doing so, that she had given this place and this grief the full presence they'd been waiting for. Not resolution, not goodbye, just presence. Actually being here, in this particular piece of land-shaped grief, instead of moving around it. It was enough. It was what she'd come for. She rode back to Mill Haven and spent 4 days reviewing county records, identifying 3 other families whose foreclosure proceedings showed the same manufactured debt instruments that had been used on the Carter property. She documented what she found and packaged it for the Territorial Attorney's Office and left it at the local marshal's office with a cover letter that explained everything clearly enough to be actioned without her present to explain it. Then she wrote 3 letters, one to each of the identified families, informing them that an investigation was underway and that there was documented evidence their original foreclosures may have been the product of fraud, and that they should contact the Territorial Attorney's Office in Caldwell. She didn't know what would happen next for those families. She didn't know which of them still wanted their land back, or had built something new and wouldn't want to return, or would feel more reopened wound than vindication. That wasn't hers to decide. What was hers to decide was whether they knew, whether they had the information and the documented path toward justice that she hadn't had 5 years ago when her own family needed it. They would know. That was what she could do. And it was not nothing. She rode back to Red Hollow on a Thursday morning, arriving in the mid-afternoon with the sun behind her and the familiar sight of Blackstone's main gate coming up on the road ahead. She'd been gone 6 weeks and the ranch looked exactly as it had when she left, which was to say, like a working operation that had gotten its footing back and was being run with the straightforward competence it had always been capable of. Dolan was at the gate. This was not an accident. Miss Carter, he said. Dolan, she said. How's the North Range? Holding up, he said. Reuben put in a new waterline section last week. Cody helped. Did a decent job. Good, she said, and rode through. The yard was in its usual afternoon rhythm. Men finishing the day's work, horses being tended, the low sound of men's voices and animal and equipment that was the specific music of a working ranch at the end of a productive day. She'd missed it, she realized. Not sentimentally, just practically, the way you miss something that turned out to be the right environment for the person you are. Luke was at the equipment barn. He'd apparently been advised of her approach. Someone had ridden ahead, or Dolan had sent a hand from the gate, or he just knew, which was also possible because he was observant in ways that still surprised her occasionally. He was standing with his hands in his pockets in that unhurried way he had, and when she dismounted, he was there without having appeared to move toward her. How was Millhaven? He said. Hard, she said. Necessary. She handed off her horse to a hand who materialized for the purpose. I found 3 more families. The territorial attorney has the documentation. He nodded. He looked at her face with the care he brought to looking at things he wanted to see accurately. And the property? Still there, she said. The creek is still there. She paused. It'll take more time on the legal side. The Tesslers are innocent parties. It needs to be handled carefully. I know a territorial land attorney, he said. Someone who specializes in title challenges involving fraud. She's very good. Then I'd like to talk to her, Naomi said. They walked toward the main house in the way they'd developed over the months of working together. Not quite side by side the way people who've arrived somewhere walk, not the careful distance configuration of their early weeks, but close enough that the gap between them was a choice and not a habit. There's something I want to show you, he said, at the porch steps. Now? Tomorrow morning's fine, he said. You should eat something first. She hadn't eaten since early morning. She hadn't mentioned it because she'd been focused on the road. That he knew to say it told her something about how well he'd learned to read the shape of her, which was information she filed and didn't comment on. They ate in the kitchen, a meal that was simple and hot, and exactly what the end of a long day on the road required, and talked about the ranch, about the new operations structure Luke had been developing, about the wage transparency system she'd outlined before she left, and that he'd been implementing with Dolan while she was away. The conversation moved the way all their best conversations moved, practically, honestly, with neither of them performing feelings they didn't have or suppressing ones they did. She was tired, real tiredness, the settled kind that meant something was done, and her body was responding accordingly. She went to her room at 8 o'clock and was asleep before the lamp was fully extinguished. In the morning, he took her to the North Range. They rode out in the early light before the full heat of the day, along the fence line that marked the original Blackstone boundary, and then through the gate into what had been, until recently, the disputed parcels, the land Mercer had been acquiring through the Westmark scheme for 4 years. The challenge had completed in the territorial proceedings. The parcels had been formally returned to Blackstone. She knew this on paper. She hadn't seen it yet in the actual ground. It was good land. She could see why he'd wanted it back. The grass ran thick along the creek bed. The elevation gave a view over the whole eastern range, and the water access was exactly as critical as she'd understood from the documents. Without it, the North Range's utility dropped significantly. He stopped at the top of a low rise and looked out over it without saying anything for a moment. My grandfather tried to buy this section 3 times, he said. The family that held it wouldn't sell. When they finally did sell 40 years ago, they sold to a neighbor out of spite, and it's been in dispute in one form or another ever since. He looked at the land. It's been in my grandfather's records as the contested North for 40 years. He never stopped thinking of it as eventually Blackstone's. And now it is, she said. Because of what you found, he said. He said it directly, the way he said things that were simply true. Not as a compliment, as an accurate statement. She looked at the land. The sun was getting into its full morning strength now, and the grass was doing the thing it does in good morning light, where each blade carries a separate brightness, and the whole field looks briefly like something that took effort to create. Luke, she said, yeah. I want to take the director position, she said, the permanent one, after Millhaven is resolved. She kept her eyes on the land. I want to build the transparent systems from the start. Wage structures, supply verification, independent auditing cycles. All of it. She paused. I also want to continue the work with the other families, using Blackstone as a base, but extending it, helping landowners in this territory build the documentation practices that make what happened here impossible to repeat. That's a large scope, he said. Yes, she said. It's what I want to do. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the side of her face with that particular quality of attention he had. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. When you came here, he said, when you took this job, was there any part of it that was about Blackstone specifically, or was it purely the first available position? She considered the honest answer. The first available position, she said. I had $12 left in a skill and I needed to use it somewhere. Right, he said. So you didn't choose this place? No. And if the position had been at a different ranch, I'd probably be uncovering a different fraud, she said, or doing someone's quarterly accounts and being bored by it. He almost smiled. The real smile, the one she'd only seen a handful of times. But you stayed, he said. I stayed, she agreed. Why? She looked at the land. The honest answer was several things at once, which was usually how honest answers worked. It was the work, the particular satisfaction of a case that required everything she had and then a little more. It was the men on this property, Reuben and his careful handwritten logs, Cody finding his spine in the middle of something that required it, even Dolan choosing, belatedly and imperfectly, the right side. It was the North Range stretched out in front of her now, land that had a history she hadn't known she was walking into, and that mattered to her now in a way that surprised her with its directness. And it was him. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even to herself. Because the work was here, she said, and because the people were worth it. She met his eyes. All of them. He held her gaze for a long moment. There was no performance in his face, no management of expression, just his actual face, in the morning light, looking at her with the unguarded steadiness of a man who had decided something and was at peace with having decided it. I'm glad you stayed, he said. Simple. True. I know you are, she said. The horses moved slightly in the way horses do when they're waiting for direction, and the morning opened around them. The land, the light, the distant sound of the creek running along the eastern edge of the North Range, and neither of them spoke for a while because there wasn't anything more to say that would have been better than the silence. The official accounting came out at the end of that year. Mercer received 5 years in the territorial prison and a formal restitution order. 3 of the other operations managers in Calver's network received comparable sentences. Calver himself received 12 years, the most severe sentence in the territory's recent history for fraud, which the territorial attorney noted publicly was intentional because a corrupt judge warranted a more severe accounting than a corrupt employee. 2 court clerks and a surveyor received shorter sentences with cooperation agreements. The Westmark Land Associates entity was dissolved. Its assets, 4 parcels of land across 3 districts, were returned to their lawful owners through a process that took another 14 months of legal work and was unglamorous and slow and necessary. 2 of the 8 families Naomi had identified from the Calver letters were successfully able to pursue title challenges. 3 others had moved on and chose not to engage the legal process, which was their right and which she respected. The remaining 3 were in various stages of proceedings when she stopped tracking them formally, because tracking everything indefinitely was not something a person could do and remain functional. The Carter Ranch title challenge was filed in Millhaven County in the spring of the following year. It was still in process when the story of Blackstone Ranch had otherwise resolved. The legal machinery moved at its own pace, and fighting it was like fighting weather. She'd learned to work within it rather than against it. The Tesler family reached out to her personally. They'd read about the proceedings in the territorial newspaper. Their letter was careful and uncertain, the letter of people who didn't know what to expect and were trying to be decent in a situation with no clear precedent. She wrote back honestly that she didn't know what the outcome would be, that her concern was the legal record being corrected rather than any specific outcome for any specific family, and that whatever happened, she hoped they understood this wasn't about them. They wrote back again. It was a better letter than the first one. She thought, reading it, that the situation might eventually resolve in a way that was tolerable for everyone involved. That was the most she could say about it honestly, and honest was all she had. Reuben retired at the end of that year, not because he was pushed out or worn down, but because he decided he'd earned it, and he was right. Blackstone had a formal retirement provision now, one of the structural changes Naomi had implemented in the new operations framework. He'd accumulated enough in back pay plus current wages plus a small bonus Luke had insisted on, quietly, without making a ceremony of it, to put himself up comfortably in Red Hollow. At his farewell dinner, a meal in the main cookhouse, not a formal event, just the ranch eating together, which it now did once a month as a practice, he made a short speech that was very much in the character of the man. Unhurried, without sentiment he didn't genuinely feel, and precise about what mattered. "I've been on a lot of ranches," he said, standing with his cup in his hand. "And most of them, the work was fine, and the pay was short, and you kept your head down and you moved on eventually. That's how it was." He paused. "This place is different now. Not because it got easier. It didn't. But because someone came in here and counted every cent we were owed and made sure we got it." He looked at Naomi across the room. "Down to the 40 cents. There was a sound from the room. Laughter, some of it, and something underneath the laughter that was more serious. She didn't make a speech in return because it wasn't her place, but she held his gaze and nodded once, and he nodded once back. And that was enough. On a Saturday morning in early spring, with the North Range turning green in the way it did every year, regardless of what the humans around it were doing, Naomi Carter stood at the fence line where she'd first talked to Luke Grayson and looked out over Blackstone Ranch with the complete, unfiltered attention of someone who's arrived somewhere and knows it. She was 35 now. Not old. Not young in the way she'd been young before she understood things. Somewhere in the middle, which was where all the real work of a life happened if you were paying attention. She'd arrived here with $12 and a suitcase, and the specific kind of fury that comes from watching injustice go unchallenged. She still had the fury. She'd stopped expecting it to go away and started thinking of it as structural, a necessary component of the kind of work she did. But it was quieter now, less consuming, more like a tool she picked up when she needed it and set down when she didn't. Luke came to the fence a few minutes after she did, which she'd expected. He had a habit of finding her here, or she had a habit of ending up here where he'd find her, and by now they'd both stopped examining which of those was more accurate. He stood beside her and looked out at the land. "The creek in the North Range is running higher than last year," he said. "Cody measured it this morning." "Good winter snowpack," she said. "The summer grazing should be strong." That's what Dolan said. They stood in the morning quiet. A hawk was working the thermal above the far pasture, circling with that particular efficiency that made it look effortless until you understood the constant adjustment it required. "I got a letter from the Millhaven attorney," she said. "The title proceedings are moving forward. She thinks by late summer." "That's good news," he said. "It is," she said. "I don't know what I'll do with it if it goes in our favor. The land, I mean. I haven't decided." "You don't have to decide yet," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not yet." She thought about her grandfather's ranch, not her grandfather, her father's father, who'd built the original house on the Carter property and run it through 30 years of drought and market collapses, and all the ordinary disasters that frontier land absorbed as a matter of course. A man she'd never met but whose choices were woven into the ground she'd stood on as a child. Stewardship, her father had called it. You hold it for the time you have it. What you do with that time is the whole question. She'd been holding Blackstone for the time she had it, building systems that would outlast her tenure, training Cody, who had turned out to have a genuine aptitude for operational management that he hadn't known about, and 2 other young hands in the practices that made theft structurally difficult, creating the kind of institutional transparency that didn't depend on any single honest person to function, making it so that what Mercer had done for 7 years would be caught in 3 months, next time, by the systems themselves, rather than by one person who happened to arrive with the right skills and the right anger. There would always be people like Mercer. She wasn't naive enough to think otherwise. There would always be men who looked at other people's labor and calculated what they could take without being immediately caught. The answer was not to wait for a person like herself to wander in and notice. The answer was to build a place where the noticing happened automatically, where the records told the truth because the structure demanded it, where no single person had the authority and the invisibility simultaneously necessary for what Mercer had done. That was what she'd built here. That was what she was most proud of, more than finding the fraud, more than the conviction and the proceedings and the formal legal record. The thing that would last was the system. I want to expand it, she said. Luke looked at her. The documentation framework, she said. What I built here, it should exist in other ranches, other operations in this territory. There's no reason the practices that make this place honest can't be made available to every ranch manager who wants them. She looked at the hawk, still working its patient circles. I want to write it up, a practical guide. Wage verification, supply auditing, independent oversight structures. Something that a working ranch can implement without needing to hire someone like me to come in and rebuild everything from scratch. A guide, he said. A real one, she said. Practical. In plain language. Not a legal document or an accounting textbook. Something that Dolan could hand to a new foreman and say, this is how we do it here. This is why. This is how you know when something's wrong. He was quiet for a moment. That's more work, he said. I know, she said. I'm good at more work. He looked at her with that expression, the one that had started as a managed neutral and over the course of a year had become something she recognized as one of the specific faces of a person who cares about you and is deciding how much of that to show at any given moment. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. The hawk made its last long circle and dropped out of sight behind the far ridge. The cattle moved in the south pasture with their permanent bovine indifference to human concerns. The creek in the north range ran higher than last year, exactly as measured. The land did what land does, endured, absorbed, held what it held and let go of what it let go of, indifferent to the stories happening on its surface. But the stories happened anyway. People arrived with suitcases and fury and $12 and the particular knowledge that some things were worth the fight, even when the fight was expensive and slow and required everything you had. People chose to stay. People chose to build systems rather than wait for heroes. People learned each other's faces in lamplight and on fence rails at dusk, and those learnings accumulated into something that wasn't tidy or perfect, but was real and durable in the way only imperfect things are. She had come here by accident. She was staying by choice. Those were different things, and the difference mattered to her more than most people would have understood. Naomi Carter had not recovered everything she'd lost. Some losses don't work that way. They reshape the landscape rather than being erased from it, and you learn to navigate the new geography rather than waiting for the old one to return. She knew that now, with the kind of knowing that lives in the body rather than just the mind. But she had built something. On this land, in this difficult and unglamorous and absolutely necessary work, she had built something that would last longer than the building of it. That was its own kind of answer to the years she'd carried the weight of what was taken. She looked out over Blackstone Ranch in the morning light, her work, her places, the ground she'd chosen to stand on, and she let herself have it, completely, without reservation, without the prepared distance she'd kept between herself and belonging for the 5 years since she'd lost the first place that was hers. It was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was the whole